Right, good morning everybody. This hearing session is now open. It forms part of the examination of the South Worcestershire Development Plan Review. This is day 9, I think, of the hearings. For us, this is a new venue. I just really want to check to make sure people can hear us okay. And a new set of microphones for us, so we'll see how we go with that. And I'm sure it will be more straightforward than last time. Thank you. We are Philip Lewis and Elaine Worthington, the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct this examination and to report to the councils in due course. As with the previous days, the format of this hearing today is it's a structured and focused discussion led by ourselves. And at this point, let's turn to the council to explain the fire escapes and the usual housekeeping matters, please.
Good morning and welcome to today's meeting. I hope you can all hear me. Lovely. So this is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photographing and making an audio recording and providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the YouTube at the channel SWDP. By choosing to attend this meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. I appreciate we're all on the ground floor here. However, the lift cannot be used and do not spend time collecting your personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed and we have doors on the left here. But please make your way out of the nearest fire exits and congregate in the middle car park by the smokers' shelter. I would like to remind speakers using microphones to turn them on and off when speaking. For those people who need Wi-Fi access, you can use the member Wi-Fi and the password is Queen Elizabeth Drive with capital Q, E and D. Thank you.
Thank you. And final introduction from us is Ian Kemp, who's a programme officer, who's sitting over there with his hand raised. Thank you. So if you need any assistance during the course of the hearing, Ian is the person that can hopefully provide that. Right, so very briefly moving on to the hearings themselves. I think the participants we're going to hear from today have taken part in previous days. But just for the avoidance of doubt, what we will do, we will start a particular topic by asking for responses to questions we have before indicating that we wish others to comment. As with previous days, where we can, we'll move on from the questions we've posed and focus on the areas where we have remaining questions. We've had some very useful responses in the statements, and of course we've read the representations too. And so we can be more focused really than the questions would allude to. If you wish to speak, please put your name board on its end, and in the session that follows this one, we'll probably have people, we have got people sitting behind, and so please try to put your name board in a place where we can see it. It's a bit more difficult with tiered seating, but if not, put your hand in the air and just draw yourself to our attention. When you're speaking, please be concise and specific. And by all means, highlight any parts of your written statement or other documents, and if possible, provide us with the reference so we can include that on our notes, so it's a lot easier for when we're back in our respective home offices reporting. Today we will aim to break mid-morning and lunchtime, and again mid-afternoon break, and the timing will depend largely on progress and where we reach at certain points. We will follow the order set out in the MIQ as matter 15 because I think the participants have raised points throughout the various policies and questions we've asked. But for matter 16, I think we're going to take it in a different order, and starting with the topics we had the most comments on from the participants in those sessions, and then people were free to leave when they made the contributions rather than sitting around all day or possibly even attending tomorrow. Hopefully it will make it a bit more efficient that way. Okay, we've got no housekeeping matters ourselves to pick up on at this point. We might have some towards the end of the session, and we certainly will. There are a few things we'll we'll mop up when we get to the end of the final matter, either today or tomorrow. At the moment, there's nothing else. Anything from the councils? No? Okay, thank you. So before we move on to our first matter this morning, as always, invite Ms Ormsby to introduce the council's team.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Suzanne Ormsby, King's Counsel, and I represent the South Worcestershire Councils, and I will invite each officer to introduce themselves, please.
Ian MacLeod, Director of Planning and Infrastructure for Malvern Hills and Wychavon Councils.
Hannah Davis, Principal Planning Officer for Malvern Hills and Wychavon District Councils.
Good morning, Andrew Ford, Principal Planning Officer for Wychavon and Malvern Hills District Councils.
Good morning, Matt Barker, Carbon Reduction Manager for Malvern Hills and Wychavon District Councils.
Thank you. And the other three participants, please. We'll start with Savills.
Morning, Andrea Kaplan from Savills for Revantage.
Good morning, Sean Lewis for Savills, of Savills for Hallam Land and the Spetchley Estate.
Hi, Chris Dodds from Planning Prospects here on behalf of the University of Worcester.
Thank you and welcome to you all. Now we have a couple of empty seats at this end of the table. We understand that the representative from the Home Builders Federation is in transit but may be stuck in traffic or may have had some delays en route. So we will start and give them the opportunity to make their comments when they arrive rather than to wait at this point. Okay, so we will move directly to matter 15, which we've grouped together policies for climate change, resource management and environmental quality. And we'll start with policy SWDPR1, climate change mitigation adaptation. We posed quite a wide-ranging question in respect to this policy, which really asking, does it serve a clear purpose and does it avoid unnecessary duplication of policies that apply to a particular area, and will it be effective? Maybe to short-circuit this somewhat, the councils have suggested some main modifications, so maybe to start by explaining those, and we'll see where that takes us in terms of discussion.
Yes, thank you. So the proposed modifications are firstly to simplify criterions A and B down, as the second sentences for those were much more explanatory in nature and better served in the RJ. Following that, in Part C, we are proposing to remove reference to EV charging, as that's now covered by building regs, and also to any other specific criterion set out in other policies, such as 5 and 26. So this becomes more of an overarching strategic policy, signposting people to the correct policies to then demonstrate their compliance.
Thank you. I think that, in general terms, picks up the nub of our question. We've had some representations from a number of people, so start with you, sir.
Thank you, sir. In regard to the question asks, is there unnecessary duplication? And there kind of is. So I think there's unnecessary duplication with SWDPR 05, sustainable design and sustainable construction. So there is a long list of criteria at criterion C, comprising sort of 16 individual policy requirements. I appreciate they're overarching requirements, but to save applicants running through swathes of policy over various pages, it's kind of recommended that the policy is reduced and simply requires development to incorporate climate change and adaptation measures sort of in accordance with adopted or relevant building regulations at the time, or in accordance with SWDPR 05. I think there are examples, so if I may just run through those just very briefly. So, for example, you could remove criterion BV from policy 05 and retain policy criterion CIV in 01, which relates to extreme weather events. And then secondly, retaining criterion BXI in policy 05 and then removing CX from SWDPR 01 as it directly repeats the text from the former. I appreciate it's quite detailed, so if you'd like me to run through again, I can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's inevitably there's going to be some duplication within or between policies. It's whether it's excessive and whether actually removing duplication is necessary for soundness. So those are points we need to take away. But any response from the councils on that?
I think the point is that it goes beyond just looking at building regs and the energy efficiency of building. It's a holistic plan-wide approach, and this policy aims to guide people to the relevant policies across the plan as a whole.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's probably one we'll take away and think about the merits of further reduction, if that's necessary for soundness, when we look at the whole suite of main modifications. Does that sound reasonable? It's partly a dare I say, a style issue in the plan, because the plan is written with some detail. Some plans are very, very brief, and just try to be consistent throughout. In terms of sounds, the main thing is to make sure there aren't any internal inconsistencies between policies. But you're right, in principle, it should be as brief as possible. Okay, we'll take that one away and have a think about that. I think probably we'll do that in terms of when the councils can provide us with the comprehensive schedule of main modifications, which we can then start reviewing in due course. Okay, any other points on that policy? If not, we'll move on to policy 05, design sustainable construction. No? Maybe to short-circuit this somewhat, it might be useful to start with the councils explaining the main modifications that have been suggested in respect of our questions, because I think they address a number of the points made by representatives. And then we can see if the representatives here agree whether they've been addressed fully or not.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I think the first question you ask is about the status of the neighbourhood plans and the reference in the submitted policy with the term account should be taken of them. Obviously, they're part of the development plan and have full weight, so we are suggesting a proposed change, or we have put forward a proposed change, which hopefully will be a main mod in time, to delete that final sentence of A1, and we're suggesting a new criterion which emphasises generally the importance of design, which is underpinned by the MPPF and the government's approach to achieving high quality design, and references a number of design documents and also includes local design statements in adopted neighbourhood plans. So I think that's the principal change in respect to your first question.
Thank you. Any comments from this side of the table to that? Does that more or less address the points that were made? Okay, should we move on to the question about the embodied carbon emissions?
Yeah, so we've made another proposed main change, which reflects really the written ministerial statement, and we're suggesting removing that reference from the policy.
Thank you. And there was a consequential change to policy 01 as well, wasn't there? Yeah. And again, this side of the table, I think it's what some of the representatives were asking for. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And similarly, the whole life cycle carbon assessment methodology question, this is 278.
Yes, that's correct. So again, to conform with the written ministerial statement, we're going to delete or proposing to delete that from the policy.
Okay, thank you. And again, any comments from this side of the table? No. Okay, so moving on now to our question 279 about the home quality mark assessment. I think our question is, we posed a similar type of question to a number of policies in that it reads to us that there's an element of compulsion with this, and given that the home quality mark assessments is one way of doing it and it's not part of development plan, we would, I think if implicated, we would want some wording to say using schemes such as home quality mark assessment or whatever, because there may be other ways of doing it. And Savills, you've got your board up. Is it one you wanted to come in on?
Excuse me, yes, I agree with that point. I think the amendment in criteria B IX relates to, as you say, it's the relationship between V, III and IX, and for major, expects all major residential development to achieve a home quality mark assessment, and for non-domestic developments there is additional text relating to or an equivalent rating. So it's as you were saying, and it's kind of the example of what if the home quality mark kind of becomes out of date. We've seen the example of the Code for Sustainable Homes. So yeah, it's just having that additional flexibility within that element of the policy. But I think you're onto it.
Any response from the councils?
Yes, thank you. So, yes, I think we recognise that there are a range of mechanisms and technical approaches to assessing sort of building quality and efficiency in buildings. So, yeah, we can look at including a reference to other industry standards in the text, sort of along those lines as a main mod.
Yeah, I think we'd be prepared to agree or equivalent assessment, which hopefully would cover the point.
Thank you. I think that's sort of the wording we were thinking, yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on now to our question 280, suggested main modification for that one. That's about the BREEAM assessments.
So, I mean, we're yes, again, this assessment to, a change to reflect the ministerial statement. Yes, so with the wording is or an equivalent rating through another nationally recognised methodology where feasible and viable.
So that creates hopefully the flexibility and doesn't make it quite so emphatic. Yep. Indeed, yes. Yep.
I've got in my notes that was a comment the planning prospects raised on behalf of University of Worcester. Are you happy with the proposed main modification?
Yeah, I think it's done exactly what we've asked for, so I think we're happy with that.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, is there anything else on that policy? If not, we'll move on. Policy 26 design. Now, okay, so start, I think we've got again a number of suggested main modifications to this, and I think we understand that councils have been reflecting upon what you want to suggest to us. So maybe we'll start with you explaining where you've got to in terms of suggested main modifications. We'll take them as per the order set out in our MIQs. So the first question was 281, which concerns again supporting evidence through homes quality mark, building for healthy life, etc.
Yes, thank you, sir. So, I mean, I think there's an issue here with the proposed changes, where we've and what we've said in the MIQs. So, in the proposed changes, we are suggesting that the reference to the BREEAM assessment is deleted. But in the MIQ response, we're actually saying that we believe that it's that the NPPF National Design Guide supports the inclusion of this type of assessment in the policy. So we are sort of conflicted there, and I think the suggested change that we put forward was an error. So we're proposing to retain the reference to BREEAM in the policy.
So if you look on page 9 of the Council's statement on matter 15, I think you'll see there that there is a misalignment between what's said and the proposed modification. That's the reference.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so the Council's position is that you want to keep the policy as submitted, which similar stroke the same as the existing
yes,
policy.
Indeed. It may be that we need to add in the magic words or equivalent assessments just to cover off the points that we've been discussing previously.
And I think that's probably the nub of our question. University of Worcester, you had some comments on this.
Yeah, I think precisely that. I think at the very least it needs wording to sort of refer to other equivalent ratings. I'm not sure if the wording of the policy is a little bit confusing anyway, because it sort of says applications should demonstrate through a design and access statement or other supporting evidence, e.g., and then lists. Whereas I think the previous policy sort of asked for the design and access statement to refer to how they've demonstrated compliance with those other assessments. So I think it needs a bit of tweaking anyway, just to make it understandable. But yeah, I think it needs reference to other ratings. And I think as well, another important element of the main mod to SWDP 5, for example, is with regard to non-domestic developments, it has that where feasible and viable wording as well, which I think needs to be included.
Thank you. So there's 2 points there. The first point really about the clarity of the policy, and maybe the clarity comes from having the example in the middle of what is otherwise a long sentence. So maybe that can be looked at. But then the second point was the one about the effect of viability. Does that need to be captured somewhere within the policy wording?
Yes, sir. I think we can definitely look at both of those points and come back with the main modification.
Thank you. Savills?
Could I just clarify that you were mentioning about the policy wording staying as is, so the reference towards applications must demonstrate is not being included? Or is it going to be applications should demonstrate?
Yeah, it's the submitted policies application should demonstrate, and I would imagine that the councils have a validation requirement for design and access statement in any event, so one of those will be produced on each scheme. So in some ways it's a given, so it's what's in the design and access statement for the relevant schemes. Okay, thank you. Just while it's in my head, a number of these changes are similar between a number of the policies, and so there's maybe a case of before you send the main mod schedule to us, just put them all side by side, just make sure they're the same. Because I'm sure we'll do that anyway, but just make sure that we don't have any inconsistencies creeping in. Thank you. Okay, we're happy to move on to the next point, which is about crime reduction measures and the secured by design guides. And again, our point there is that secured by design, although they're a very worthy thing to do, and crime reduction is very important, secured by design is not part of the development plan, it's not embodied in the plan, and there may be other ways of doing the same thing. So it's a similar sort of point really about the wording.
Maybe having regard to, as opposed to consistent with. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think that's the approach we've taken in other policies, isn't it? Yeah. Again, any comments on this side of the table? Okay, fine. We'll move on to the final question about this. It's a question about criterion B, Roman 12, I think it's concerning the effect upon nesting goals and suggested main modification. Can you explain that, please?
Yes, so we are suggesting a main modification to that, having discussed the policy with our conservation officers. So the modification is to sort of change the focus of the policy really on the reducing the impact of goals on buildings and the wider environment, rather than perhaps the perhaps stronger wording, which is about reducing gull populations.
Yeah, I can understand the sentiments behind that, but I think the amended wording would address our points around the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Yeah, lovely, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Policy 32, Telecommunications and Broadband. It's an area where there seems to be quite regular change through the building regulations. There has been over the last few years. We've posed a question regarding the purpose of the policy, given what the building regulations currently say. I've not looked to check whether they've been changed since I wrote the question, but they may have been. It's a fast-moving world. The council, you responded with a main modification in respect to Part A, that's to delete it. And I think because that does duplicate the requirement in the building regulations anyway, but you set out we wish to retain Part B, which provide the answer for you because those matters aren't covered in building regulations. Am I right in remembering that? Yeah, okay. So before we open it up, and probably before I turn to the policy, there's a figure set out in Part B referring to ducting infrastructure, 120% capacity requirements. What's the basis of that figure? I'm just really thinking about the effectiveness. I mean, how would that be dealt with through the development management process?
I think so. The emphasis there is to encourage positive outcomes in terms of installing broadband in new development and set a requirement. But it isn't part of the building regulations part R. That's agreed. No.
Okay, thank you. Look to this side of the room. Does anyone have any comments to make? We have some written comments from the Home Builders Federation. We'll give them the opportunity to comment should they manage to navigate the A46 and actually get here. But if not, we have the written comments on that. There's one we can take away. Okay, let's move on then to policy 33, renewable and low carbon energy. I think it'd be helpful if the councils could start by explaining what the justification is for the requirements set out in Part A of the policy.
Thank you, sir. So, the Planning and Energy Act allows local authorities to impose reasonable requirements for a proportion of energy to be sourced from renewable and low carbon energy in the locality of development. We have a current policy that in the adopted plan for 10%, and we are proposing to increase that to 20% based on Worcestershire LEP energy strategy, the County Council's planning for renewable energy in Worcestershire, and the West Midlands Energy Capacity Study evidence. This was based on what's achievable with current building regs using a kind of single source of renewable energy, and it's been viability tested, and there's flexibility within the policy. So should that not be achievable, there's flexibility there.
Okay, thank you. Any comments on this side of the table? Savills?
Yes, thank you. We would just point out that I think the 20% total energy demand target is a very challenging target, and particularly as it relates to regulated and unregulated energy demand. And some of the end users on development, obviously we don't know exactly who they're going to be. So that 20% could be very challenging, but we do recognise there is a clause in terms of viability. But we will question the actual evidence for the 20% in the first place.
Okay, thank you. I don't think we have any further questions on that. Okay. Okay. So, welcome to the Home Builders Federation. You want to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rachel Damon from the Home Builders Federation. I'm sorry I'm late. There was a smash on the diversion of the A46.
I'm glad you made it. Um, yeah, the CPRE here to sit at the table as well. Do you want to come and join us? Yeah, maybe just take a couple of minutes while you all get set up. Then what we've gone through the questions. We're up to question or policy 34. And what I've tried to do is pose the questions from your respective statements and representations, and I think you would have seen the main mods. I think probably the best thing to do is just give yourselves a couple of minutes just to get yourself sorted, and I think we'll carry on through to the end, and then if you want to comment on those previous policies, just an opportunity to go through there. You haven't heard the discussion, but broadly we've discussed the Council's main modifications that in most cases, or nearly every case, has addressed the points raised. There's one or two things we said we'd take away, but generally speaking, the comments made by representatives have been responded to by the Council by deleting some requirements or adding in more flexibility to policies. But we'll give you an opportunity to come back rather than go back now. I think it's the right thing to do. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. We'll just adjourn, say, until 10 past, until you two are set up, and then we'll carry on. Have you trying to connect to the internet? Yeah. Okay. Okay, are you okay to resume? Okay, let's resume the hearing then. So welcome to representatives from the CPRE, Worcestershire and the Home Builders Federation. I suggest first time you speak, if you just say your name and then we'll just go from there rather than read the introductions. So we've got to policy 34, management of flood risk, and it's our question 286.
So sorry, sir. Have we moved on from policy 33? Are you content on the submissions that you've had on that?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, there was just one additional point that we were going to suggest. We don't think that 20% is challenging for the reasons that we've given in our written statement. But if you did have any concern, we would be prepared to include the words after has been demonstrated that this is feasible and or would make the development unviable. So if there's a problem in terms of actually delivering it, which is not related to viability for some other reason, the word, if it can be shown to be not feasible, would cover off that point. For example, in relation to perhaps one house. So that might be the flexibility that's required to overcome any problems with that policy.
Yes, I think that's a good point, and maybe on the orientation of that particular property,
Yes.
solar may not work, and
Yes.
there may be other reasons why you wouldn't want
Quite.
other things. Just really let's looking back at the comments from this side of the table then. Are people broadly happy with that in terms of addressing the points raised in statements? It adds in that sort of flexibility where it's just not possible. Okay, should we go with that then?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
We'll write the note down. Thank you.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, let's move on to policy 34, management of flood risk then. And again, probably the easiest way for us would be for the councils to explain the suggested main modifications to the policy.
Thank you, sir. So, yes, there's a number of changes. So, criterion A is proposed to reference flood risk and coastal change planning practice guidance instead of the Environment Agency. Additionally, it's proposed to amend criterion M regarding flood risk on caravans, mobile homes and chalets. And we've sort of set out the reasons for that in our response, and also to remove the final part of the sentence within criterion M. We believe then that will make the policy consistent with the PPG.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from this side of the room? I've not got any note of anyone having commented on this policy in their statements. Okay, let's move on to policy 35, sustainable drainage systems then. Again, there's a number of suggested main modifications. So look to the councils to explain those.
So, yes, there's a couple of changes here. So within criterion B, by referencing the term should have regard to or read in conjunction rather than must. That's considered to give flexibility within the policy. It's also proposed to modify criterion E1 as not enforce compliance with non-technical guidance of Water UK, and to make the policy more clearly written and unambiguous. We still believe maintaining reference to those criteria is important in terms of how the policy is applied.
Thank you. And there's a couple of criteria that would be struck out, I think. The main mod schedule I have crossed out because of duplication with policy 34.
It's criterion 2, sir, which we're proposing to remove. Yeah, and A3.
Okay, thank you. Any comments on this side of the room? Okay, well, if that's the case, we'll move on to policy 36, which is concerned with water resources, efficiency and wastewater treatment. Posed several questions there. The first one was about the optional national technical standards for water, and I think the place to start is for the councils to explain the evidence justification for the application of the optional technical standard in this case, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. So that has been obviously subject to discussion with Severn Trent Water, references exam number 7. We've been engaging with them, and Severn Trent are supportive of this approach. The other reasons are set out in our, I won't read this out, sir, but the other paragraphs are sort of set out within our response to this question. But the main justification is from the discussions with Severn Trent.
And that's on the basis that the area is seriously stressed.
Yes,
in terms of water.
that's the point. So yes, that's the designation that's been applied to it. Seriously water stressed area.
Okay, look to this side of the table. If anyone, any comments on that? No. Okay, let's move on to question 289, which concerns water use and BREEAM. And again, if the council can explain the justification for this requirement, please.
Yes, again, so based on discussions with Severn Trent Water, the BREEAM excellent standard for obviously domestic developments. Again, Severn Trent feel achieving that standard will help address some of the challenges around water shortages within the area, and have supported its inclusion.
Okay, thank you. Any comments inside of the table on that? Nope. Okay. We'll move on to policy 37, air quality. There's a main modification suggested to this. If you could please explain that.
Yes, thank you, sir. So the representation that we had to Regulation 19 from Natural England suggested that the policy ought to include air quality relating to the natural environment as well as human health. So we have we're proposing a main modification to widen the policy really to include the natural environment as well, and I think that's set out in the Statement of Common Ground as well, I think, with Natural England. So that's the principal change. We've also, in respect to your specific question, and written statements that have been received, we have looked at the requirement for an air quality assessment for development over 100 dwellings, and we've discussed this with Worcestershire Regulatory Services, who are the environmental health body for the county, and they've explained that the latest guidance from the Environmental Protection UK and also the Institute of Air Quality Management actually has effectively removed that requirement. So we're suggesting a modification to delete that criterion. And in doing so, Worcestershire Regulatory Services, again, have suggested a few updates to the policy since it was drafted 2 or 3 years ago to sort of bring it in line with latest guidance. So those will be coming to you as a main mod.
Okay, thank you. It would be useful to have the references to the sources behind the changes there. I think that would help us a lot. Maybe a brief note or...
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, before we go back to the beginning and bring in the Home Builders Federation and CPRE if they so wish, Policy 39, Minerals and Waste Safeguarding. Given that there's two-tier local government in this area, we posed a question around relationship of the plan and policy with the Worcestershire Minerals local plan. I think we have the information we need from the council's response. You can take that. Yeah. So I don't think we need to dwell on that unless someone wants to contribute anything. No. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, very happy to provide the opportunity for Home Builders Federation and CPRE to comment on the policies that you weren't at the table for. So now's your opportunity. So we'll start maybe with the Home Builders Federation and then we'll move to CPREs. If you want to just go through the questions sort of briefly and the comments you want to make, and if necessary the council can remind the room the point we reached on those.
Thank you for accommodating me and apologies again. I think our main concerns related to Policy 27 about biodiversity and geodiversity, and it's really informed by our experience of delivering BNG in practice since it came in over a year ago. What we're finding is that it's particularly challenging.
That's the next matter.
Is it? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
So you're not too late
Haven't
for that
missed
one.
it.
We haven't
Brilliant.
done it yet. No.
So that's the thing that we have mainly to comment on.
Okay, good. Well, we look forward to that. Okay. I think trying to explain earlier, so what we have done is that, what the council have done is responded quite positively, I think, to the various suggestions in representations and statements, particularly in addressing the points where some of the policies were suggesting development should be considered in accordance with documents that aren't part of the development plan primarily, and in each case we've discussed wording about that in order to remove those concerns by and large, and to add in flexibility where necessary should guidance or whatever change.
Yeah. So that was kind of the point I was coming to, that what we're finding through delivering BNG is it's very challenging and it's mandatory. And therefore what needs to happen elsewhere in the plan is there to be more flexibility and opportunity to have discussion, because obviously you can't do less than 10% BNG because that's nationally required. So we are finding in other plans that there needs to be more flexibility in other policies that the council can do. So things around energy efficiency, things around design standards, just things around assessments and clarity. And it's really just providing that open door for developers to come and have a chat if there's a problem, so that schemes can come forward, because some of the BNG things are emerging as sites are being delivered. So it's really just having that onward engagement. But I think this council is quite open for that generally, and the policies are fairly flexible and accommodating, and our concerns about including stuff that isn't policy have been addressed through the main changes. So we're generally happy about proposals elsewhere, but the knock-on effect of our comments about BNG is it will need more flexibility in other policies in some cases.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's not really uppermost in our minds in seeking the changes to individual policies, though I think the net result is one that you're seeking. So yeah, so thank you for all of that. Okay, CPRE Worcestershire, do you want to? No? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think that's us done for matter 15. I think we'll take a brief pause now whilst Ian can sort out name boards, etc., and then we shall resume. Yeah, we'll resume at 10:35. Okay, thank you. Let's resume the hearing and move on now to matter 16. I think everyone is around the table who needs to be around the table now. Thank you to Ian for sorting that out. Okay, so before we move on to discuss these policies, you should have all seen the amended order in which we'll deal with them. We'll manage that as we go through, just trying to keep things efficient. As we have a number of new participants around the table, we'll very briefly do the introductions again. So we'll start with the councils, please. Ms Ormsby.
Thank you, Sir. Suzanne Ormsby, King's Counsel, acting for the South Worcestershire Councils.
Ian MacLeod, Director of Planning and Infrastructure for Malvern Hills and Wychavon Councils.
Hannah Millman, Planning Policy Manager for Worcester City Council.
Emily Barker, Planning and Transport Planning, Worcestershire County Council.
Duncan Rudge, Head of Planning at Worcester City Council.
Okay, and we're going to go immediately behind, so to Gloucestershire County Council then.
Alistair Kent from Gloucestershire County Council Strategic Planning.
Sarah Jordan, Land and Property Manager from Malvern Hills Trust.
Okay, I think we've got a few at the back here, so maybe we'll do this side of the room first. Yep, so it's Town Legal.
Yes, thank you. Mike Best for Homes England and Summix, and I'm accompanied by David Frisby from Mode Transport Planning.
Thank you. I think just to try to keep it simple for us, we'll go along the front row, then back along, and then to the rear row. So for Savills.
Yeah, Andrea Kaplan, Savills on behalf of Revantage.
Sean Lewis, Savills on behalf of Hallam Land and Special Estate.
Chris Dodds from Planning Prospects, here on behalf of the University of Worcester.
Rachel Damon from the Home Builders Federation.
Andy Pitt, CPRE, Campaign for Protection Rural England, Worcestershire.
Catherine Harris, a resident of Malvern.
Thank you. Now we'll go behind Catherine Harris. To you in the corner, sir.
John Mills from the Cotswolds National Landscape.
Catherine Laidlaw from the Malvern Hills National Landscape.
Matthew Bunt from Tetlow King Planning on behalf of Abbey College and Hekmat Cava.
Charles Tucker, Councillor in Pershore.
Paul Reardon from Little Malvern and Welland Parish Council.
Sue Hayward from Little Malvern and Welland Parish Council.
Nicola Inchbald from Inchbald Planning on behalf of the Sermon family and the Croom Estate, and I'm accompanied by Peter Sermon.
Sue Satchell from Malvern Hills Trust.
Jonathan Bills, Conservation Manager, Malvern Hills Trust.
Sarah Jordan, Malvern Hills Trust.
Thank you. Does anyone behind or not a participant? Okay, have we covered everyone? Good, thank you. Well, welcome to you all. I think most of you, I think, have attended previous sessions. For those of you that don't, if you want to speak during the session, please put your name board up on the end in a place where you think we can see. Now, line of sight is going to be interesting, and we apologise now because we won't always be able to see them. But please raise your hand or draw attention to us in another polite way, please, if we don't see you. It's almost bound to happen, so that's fine. It's just the nature of the room. So let's move on to Policy 6, Transport. And we pose a number of questions around this policy, which we'll go through, I think, in the order we've set out. But of course, in some of the other sessions, we've talked around transport modelling, we've talked about transport implications of development in various fashions, and so we have quite a large part of the picture before us. But we're looking particularly at this Policy 6 today, because we've done the consideration of transport matters, and we'll go away and think about that further in respect to site-specific issues. So really we're just concerned with the policy. We don't really want to go back over old ground if we can avoid it, though if people haven't been to a previous session and want to say something, now's the opportunity to do so. I think probably the best place to start would be just to invite the councils to just provide an overview on why they think the plan would be effective in dealing with significant impacts from development proposed in the plan on the road network in terms of capacity and highway safety, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, sir. So the council's approach to development through this plan has been to locate settlements which offer a range of transport solutions. So the major settlements at Worcestershire Parkway, Throckmorton, Rushwick and Mytton, which is within reasonable proximity to a station, either have a station very close by or within the settlement boundary themselves. As well as rail, obviously we feel that there's opportunities within these new settlements at scale to offer significant improvements in terms of bus infrastructure, placing that at the heart of the new settlements coming forward, as well as movement, obviously encouraging cycling and walking facilities across these new sites. Taking that as the sort of first principle, we've then obviously modelled in some detail the new settlements themselves, along with the other allocations within the plan. There's been two approaches to that with the Worcester Strategic Transport Model, which is obviously a county-wide model looking at the impacts across the whole of the plan area, and then in more detail with national highways with the development of the micro-sim models, looking at the junctions on the motorway network, and particularly junction 6, 7 and junction 9 in relation to Mytton, and obviously as well in relation to the A46, which is part of National Highways network. The conclusion of those reports is subject to a range of mitigations which have been tested through the infrastructure delivery plan, is that the transport impacts of the plan as a whole can be effectively mitigated, both in terms of the national highway network and obviously the local network. We've had some discussions around junction 9, in particular in relation to Mytton, but National Highways' position has been set out quite clearly, and in relation to the other junctions, they have no objection, obviously, to the plan, and similarly that is the case with Worcestershire County Council. So we believe our approach to transport modelling and impacts has been robust, subject to the mitigations being put forward, the impacts on the plan area can be effectively mitigated.
Thank you. You mentioned junction 9. I think it will be helpful at the appropriate point when the work is being completed to get an updated view from National Highways going forward. And I think that's really one of the last pieces of the jigsaw we need for in relation to Mytton and junction 9, isn't it? Okay, thank you. Well, we'll come back to that in some fashion on another day, at some other, in the future. Okay, so the policy has a number of main modifications suggested. I think maybe we'll pick those up as we go through the various questions. That's probably the easiest way to do that. Okay, so I'll just really open it up to people who want to put forward their views on this particular point about the overall effectiveness of the plan in terms of transport. We've got various comments made in statements, and my note in front of me refers to the joint parishes. I made some comments around Throckmorton, and the Malvern Hills Trust reiterated comments about access, off-site improvements and access relating to land. We discussed in some detail and some of the site-specific matters. But it's an opportunity now for people to comment. CPRE?
I found when I read the policy, SWDP 06, there seemed to be an emphasis on things like active travel. And when you apply it to sites such as the employment land, the substantial major development along Blackmore Park Road, B4208, I couldn't quite tie it in with things like the use of lorries, HGVs that would inevitably be accessing such a major development along Blackmore Park Road, including Willow End. Arguably, and I won't repeat this, but you have to wonder why such a major development, I think it's around 24 hectares or something of employment land, is being located at a location that straddles the boundary with the AONB, but I'll leave that to others to discuss. the other emphasis I felt, again an observation, was that there was much emphasis placed on works to do with motorway junctions, improving access at motorway junctions. What I found was looking at, for example, this example of Blackmore Park Road employment land, the lack of addressing local road network, junctions on local road network beyond the actual road itself. So on Blackmore Park Road, 3 junctions are discussed. And in that 1 mile stretch of road, I think there was something like the traffic impact assessment report, Jacobs, December 2021. It was apparent that there are 3 junctions with the proposed Blackmore Park Road employment sites will need to be upgraded. And that 1 mile of B4208 will need to undergo around £2 million worth of upgrades, including signalisation, curved islands, additional lanes to accommodate the anticipated HGVs, etc. But really that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? That's the immediate access to the site. And what I was trying to get straight was, has anybody actually looked at a map and envisaged the problem and impact of routinely driving heavy lorries and HGVs to places like Worcester, Hereford, Bromyard and Leominster? The topography and steep, narrow junctions in and around Malvern mean that many of the old Victorian roads will similarly need upgrading, and each upgrade, if technically feasible, will degrade the very fabric of Malvern that makes it and its AONB a national tourist destination site. Local towns and villages such as Ledbury and Callowen will also suffer from the increased throughput and may also require upgrading as the HGVs, lorries, etc. undertake their deliveries to and from the local cities and motorway access. I'd suggest that this problem is not treated, the problem of junctions on local networks, local road networks, isn't treated as a desktop study, but as a practical exercise and consideration being given as to how the council black signs and national weight limit restriction signs can be used to funnel lorries away from the many inappropriate shortcuts that will exist. In a sense, only when all of those upgrades to the local highways network required to address capacity, congestion and highway safety issues have been evaluated, can the true feasibility and cost of the proposed developments be sensibly determined? But will that evaluation be done? All that appears to have been addressed is the immediate road, the access to that employment land, and all of the issues behind that appear not to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to the council to the opportunity to respond to those points.
Thank you, sir. So obviously we discussed the specifics of these allocations at the previous session in relation to Malvern. Blackmore Park Road, subject to that allocation coming forward, would really need a range of improvements. Some of those have just been articulated there, both in terms of the junction network, but also importantly also improving access by walking and cycling to that site as well. So it would be a package of infrastructure improvements which would need to come forward. Inevitably, development in Malvern will have some impact in Malvern, but we believe what we've assessed through the IDP can be effectively mitigated through the junction improvements which have been talked about, and that range of other measures which can be put in place. So we feel the plan and the allocations specifically have been looked at by the County Council, and they've been modelled through the strategic model, and the impacts again have been shown to be effectively mitigated.
Okay, and all of the schemes have been looked at in a cumulative fashion through the model?
Absolutely, both on an individual and cumulative basis. So, and in our response to when we looked at this site at the previous hearing session, again, the county have confirmed that the impacts of this development can be addressed on a site-specific level, and then the cumulative effects in Malvern have been considered through the strategic model, and again have been proved to be effectively mitigated.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn to you now. Sorry, I can't see the board. I can just see the underneath of it.
Right, sorry.
Catherine Harris, yeah.
I'm a resident of Malvern, and some CPRE is touched on some of the topics I was going to say, but it was in relation to the all the proposals in Malvern, employment and housing. They are very spread out all across the eastern approach of Malvern, and they are particularly in terms of employment and for housing for people commuting, a long way from the fast road networks. And that does mean, as has been just touched on, that will have vast implications for many, many roads across Malvern, not just the ones in the immediate vicinity of the sites, but in all across the area, which again has an impact as in terms of the ANOB, and potentially degrading the NOB because of the substantial changes that are needed with creeping urbanisation, more noise, lack of tranquility, and the health and affecting the health and well-being of the people in the area. And it's significant that on a recent inquiry to a firm that trains HGV drivers, when asked how they would go from, say, Blackmore Park to Worcester, they would use a network of roads from there along Poolbrook to the Garlford Road, maybe to the Rid, or, as many do even now, using a small country road. People locally would know it as a Cleveland Lane, a C road, which is very inappropriate for HGV vehicles. And again, to join the Worcester Road. So it has an impact much wider than just the particular sites. And in terms of the particular issues in relation to Malvern, which are very specific, and many of the roads around the site selected and beyond have land on either side which belong to a third party, the Malvern Hills Trust, which is very Malvern specific. As the sites are dotted around, the number of roads requiring widening and junctions requiring remodelling, considerable amounts of common land by MHT would be used up. And that poses another concern. The land that the MHT look after is for the public for the purposes of recreation and enjoyment. With less land available at lower levels, there'd be likely to be more problems of erosion and overuse of the hills, as more people would be forced up there because there's less common land at the lower levels. And that too would have a degrading effect on the ANOB. The impact, also the impact on the existing residents, health, well-being, permanent effects of loss of tranquility. And it would irreversibly damage the special qualities of the ANOB. And the cumulative effect of all this extra traffic from the sites and permeating through the road networks would be horrendous. And I do feel that such substantial alterations would be devastating for the town. Part of its charm are the narrow rural roads we have and the wide sweeping commons. And in terms of the NPPF, it does paragraph 185, does not specifically in transport, I admit, but it does refer to that decisions should, in relation to development, should consider the health, the living conditions, natural environment, and the potential sensitivity of the sites in the locality, and to identify and protect tranquil areas. And quite seriously, I do feel that Malvern, with these developments and the road network as well, is on the brink of being devastated by these plans. The ANOB is going to be degraded to such a degree that I do wonder whether it would be worth its designation ultimately. It is at tipping point.
Thank you. Mr MacLeod, any points there you wish to comment? I mean, we have had discussions around some of these matters before in the Malvern allocation session, but if you want specifically, you want to come back on now.
Thank you, sir. So I think I'd probably just take you to the main transport policy, which sets out a whole range of improvements in terms of public transport connectivity, both connecting Malvern Station to a number of the sites, coming forward within this plan. We've talked previously about a new railway station being proposed at Rushwick and how that would lead to improved bus services connecting some of these developments into the main town centres at Malvern and also into Worcester. So we believe we put forward a package of proposals which will mitigate the impacts of development, improving public transport, putting emphasis on bus and rail travel, and obviously with the intention of minimising car use. Obviously, there will be some growth in car traffic, which comes forward off the back of this plan. That is inevitable, but what the county-wide model has shown is that the impacts on Malvern on the transport network can be effectively managed. And I wouldn't agree with the comments on the AONB. We've put forward an extensive range of measures, which we'll come on to talk about under green infrastructure, which look to manage the impacts on the AONB and the SSSI itself. So we believe, as looking at the plan as a whole, the green infrastructure-led approach, minimising travel to the hills, and the AONB will help to manage those impacts successfully.
Thank you. Okay, so go to the Cotswold National Landscape.
Thank you. So I have a query really, which is related to this policy in relation to whether impacts can be mitigated to an acceptable degree. And it relates specifically to the mitten allocation. When that was discussed at the hearing last week, it was there was some discussion about whether the allocation at Mitten would increase traffic movements on roads through the Cotswolds National Landscape and adjacent to the National Landscape by 10% or more. And it was my understanding, sir, that you had said that you would be happy to receive further comments or further submissions on that issue by the 17th of April. So with that in mind, I did submit further comments on that issue, which I sent to Mr. Kemp, but he said that he wasn't aware that you'd allowed for that. So really, I just wanted to clarify whether you are happy for that submission to be submitted and whether you're happy for that to take on board that submission. And also you did, I think, indicate that we could potentially come back to that issue this month if necessary. So I just wanted to check if, I'm presuming you're not anticipating doing that, but I just wanted to check if that was the case.
Okay, so what we have two matters that we need to give further consideration to in respect of Mitten in relation to transport and ecological matters. There's further work being undertaken in respect of both, but particularly the ecological work will not be finished until the end of July, the end of the bird breeding season, etc. So it is our intention to come back to those matters, and we will invite further submissions from those representatives, stroke participants at the appropriate time. Whether we deal with everything by way of written representations or we deal with it by a further hearing session is yet to be decided, and we'll see where we get to. We have got a tentative week in mind in September where we would come back to a further session. We need to think about the mechanics of that and how it will fit together. It's something that may lend itself to a virtual session, which means it's easier to slot it into the week because people aren't travelling. But we'll come back to that. So there will be a further opportunity and exchange of statements, etc. about that, and we will let people know at the appropriate time. Mr. Kemp did make us aware of the information you sent in. I think it's probably better if we deal with that all together, and we need to think about the mechanism of the timing for that. So thank you for what you've done, and we'll just try to work out the process to make sure that it's effective and fair.
Okay, thank you.
So we will be coming back to that.
Okay, so my submission is kind of on hold until all the information is
because
reviewed.
what you may wish to do is actually to update it, amend it when you see what the council would publish. We need to work out the order in which things are done, but it's likely we would publish the council documents and then invite people to comment on those with the information you want to present. In the meanwhile, very happy for you and other participants to be talking to the other parties and reach as much common ground as we can before to make the need for our questions as small as possible, so we can just narrow down on what the main outstanding issues are that we need to form a view on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think that would be really helpful if that could be done in amongst all the other things that the councils need to be doing. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next board I can see it's no doubt the Malvern Hills Natural Landscape. I can see Natural Landscape and that's the other one, so...
Good guess, thank you. Yeah, just to briefly make a comment without going over the same ground in relation to the Malvern allocations, but I just wanted to flag up in specifically to this question of ensuring any significant impacts while the traffic modelling looks to relieve any stresses on the transport network. What it doesn't do is consider those knock-on impacts onto particularly the national landscape and its special qualities. So there seems to be a contradiction with the reasoned justification 6.5 where which says development proposals within or on the periphery of these highly valued landscapes, both the Cotswolds and Malvern Hills, should not give rise to significant traffic increases and associated effects on tranquility and enjoyment. But the modelling done shows there will be significant increases in traffic. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. MacLeod?
I don't think it certainly doesn't conclude that the impact on traffic will be significant. I mean, this is obviously supporting text to the policy, looking at how new development could come forward, and is obviously setting out an approach there that we wouldn't want to see significant impacts on the AONB itself. So we stand by that approach. As I said in my response to my previous answer, you have to read the plan as a whole in terms of the mitigation package being put forward towards the AONB and the national landscape. There's significant measures being proposed through this plan to mitigate the impact. It's not just transport based. From a transport assessment point of view, we stand by the modelling work that's been done, and I think it's quite right then to have some reference within here in the policy that we're still seeking obviously to protect that tranquility point with other development proposals that come forward.
Okay, and going forward, development proposals will be considered within the updated duty in the legislation. Some weeks ago now, but would that be captured in the plan? Is that a matter for supporting text, possibly? Maybe to refer to that. I can't remember if we discussed that before.
I think in terms of that requirement, it would probably be helpful to put something in the supporting text, so we're happy to, we'll put some words to that effect.
Yeah, whether that's around the landscape policy or it needs to be in there once, doesn't it, to reflect that? Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just briefly, just to make it clear that when we come on to discuss the green infrastructure policy and the specifics around the treble SI, not to conflate the whole designated landscape. The treble SI is just one part, and that mitigation strategy is specifically to address recreational pressure, not necessarily the cumulative impacts from employment allocations. So yeah, just to be aware that we don't kind of confuse the two, the treble SI as one element of the wider designated area later on in the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine. I think we've got your point that special qualities include the triple SI, nature conservation issues, as well as all the other things that make the area special, as described in your management plan. So yeah, I think we will bear that in mind when we move forward this afternoon. Councillor Tucker. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Councillor Tucker.
Thank you. I'm sure you remember that I made a request under the strategic allocations policies for a main modification to be required, enabling the impact on Pershore of the two proposed strategic sites at Parkway and at Throckmorton to be considered in terms of their impact on Pershore, and specifically related to the fact that Pershore was designated in 1964 as a gem town requiring specific and special consideration in the planning system. And the proposed plan makes no reference to that or to the need for any specific protection for Pershore as a community. One of the main issues in that, obviously, was the question of traffic and the impact on that. And I did highlight the impact on Station Road, Worcester Road, and Three Springs Road. But there was, unfortunately, at that stage, no quantitative information to back up those assertions. However, we now have modelling which has been carried out by a developer in relation to a new allocation or a new site of 112 houses being on Holloway. And that draws also on modelling information which was developed in relation to the site of 300 houses which is allowed at appeal in the vicinity of Tidgesley Wood, something which has caused consternation within the town, but however it has been given approval at appeal, and that obviously has a significant potential impact on the traffic network. And the highways, county highways, have very helpfully provided a letter which relates to that development, or the development on Holloway, which I think is directly relevant to the points I made before, but it provides actual quantification. The first statement in this letter, which I'd like to draw to your attention, is that it states, without mitigation at the A4104 Three Springs Road, stroke B4084 Worcester Road junction, and the B4084 Worcester Road, stroke A4104 Station Road, stroke B4084, sorry for the complication here, the High Street signal junction, without mitigation at these junctions, the development proposals would result in a severe congestion and unacceptable highway safety impact on Three Springs Road. Now, that is relating to these developments that are proposed, but in fact will have taken no account of the impact or the traffic numbers and the impact on the junctions and the highway coming into Pershore of the Parkway or Throckmorton developments. So what we're looking at here is really only relating to developments which have already been approved and which are going to take place in the period up to 2030. The model then, which has been developed, states that in the 2030 forecast year with development, that is the two developments I mentioned on Holloway and by Tidgesley Wood, vehicle queues on the Three Springs Road arm of the A4104 are shown to increase by 8 vehicles compared to the reference case in the AM peak hour and by 6 vehicles in the PM peak hour. However, Worcestershire Highways notes that vehicle queues extend beyond the network modelled in Paramix and suppressed demand is visible. The increase in vehicle queue length on the Three Springs Road is primarily caused as vehicles are prevented from turning right into Worcester Road by the vehicle queue extending from the A4104 Station Road, Worcester Road, High Street signals. So we're getting a blocking situation where the Three Springs Road junction meets Worcester Road. They continue, and I hope you don't mind me quoting this, but it's not that long. In the 2030 with development scenario, during the PM peak hour, vehicle queues are shown to increase by 10 vehicles when compared to the 2030 reference case. And the highways comment that it is not possible to determine if the vehicle queues would increase beyond an additional 10 vehicles because the model doesn't provide for that. Now, the journey time analysis, which is obviously of great consideration, shows that in the 2030 with development scenario, journey times on Three Springs Road, that is the time it takes a vehicle joining the end of the queue on Three Springs Road to travel through the junction, increases by 82 seconds, nearly a minute and a half. And if one considers that during that time, further vehicles are piling in at the back of the queue. It will not take very much consideration to recognise that the impact of that could be very significant. So it's increasing by 82 seconds during the AM peak hour and 75 seconds during the PM peak hour compared to the 2030 reference case. During the PM peak hour, journey times on Station Road increased by 43 seconds compared to the 2030 reference case. And again, the consequence is a substantial increase in traffic queues. Those figures, I think, are very relevant because, of course, this model took account only of the proposed developments that are already in the pipeline, and I believe took no account of the impact of the additional traffic generated by the strategic developments, particularly at Parkway, but also at Throckmorton. So I'd just like to repeat the feeling that it is necessary for there to be a main modification for the plan to take account of the impact of the strategic developments on Pershore. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's not for us to comment on planning proposals being considered by other people. We won't do that, and I'm sure the councils won't want to comment upon a live scheme anyway. But do you have any comments in response to the wider Pershore question in relation to the strategic proposals?
Thank you, sir. So, yeah, so it wouldn't be appropriate to get into that individual planning application, which obviously had its own transport assessment submitted with it. I think, as I gave in response to this question previously, the infrastructure delivery plan proposes a whole range of improvements to Pershore, including Station Road and a number of other junctions which have been flagged in that response. When those improvements are modelled, obviously we are seeing a growth of traffic, as you would expect, with Worcestershire Parkway and Throckmorton, which are major settlements coming forward. But the improvements which have been put into the strategic model again showed those impacts can be effectively mitigated and those junctions improve. So we're happy from a strategic modelling basis that the impacts of growth coming forward in this plan on Pershore will be effectively mitigated.
Thank you. I move on to Gloucestershire County Council.
Yeah, it's only really a minor point, and you've touched on this already, but thank you for the opportunity to be here. We just wanted to say, for avoidance of doubt, really, that we reaffirm our current position as a neighbouring authority in respect of question 292, insofar as it relates to Mytton. Our position is as per the statement of common ground that we've got at the moment with the councils, together with my highways colleagues' comments at the hearing session a few weeks back, and we'll look to revisit the statement of common ground at the point at which we have the extra information on junction work. That's all we really want to say. Thanks.
Thank you, and obviously we would welcome any further comments from Gloucestershire County Council, because given the location of Mytton on the county boundary, many of the effects of that development, should we endorse the allocations, would be felt within Gloucestershire. So that would be really helpful, thank you. Are there any other name boards around we can't see? Because if not, we'll move on to our next question, which is 293. And we just really posed a question as to what was meant by at least maintain highway safety in the policy, and whether it's consistent with national policy. Maybe just invite the councils to respond and then open it up from there.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. The plan is looking to put an emphasis on active travel, and with that comes a wider variety of road users. So it is partially in recognition of that you are likely to find over the plan period, you would get a wider variety of road users on the network. When looking at both paragraphs 112 and 111 of the MPPF, paragraph 112 does require the creation of places that are safe, secure and attractive, which we feel this wording does go some way to addressing. However, if it's felt that we could better align with the MPPF wording of not having an unacceptable impact on highway safety, then we would be putting that forward as a modification to the policy.
I think that would be something we would support because it just removes any scope for discussion in subsequent events, hearings and inquiries as to what the meaning of it is and whether it's consistent with national policy. I think that would be a good change for effectiveness. Okay, no boards up. So we'll move on to our next point, which refers to the Worcestershire Local Transport Plan. And again, this is a point we made with a number of policies that having regard to rather than in accordance with, because it's an important document, it's not part of a development plan.
Yes, we would propose that as a modification to change that wording so that it would read have regard to.
Thank you. I think that actually addresses a point to some representatives. So I take it there's no further comment from anyone on that. And I think actually a common point is in the preparation of the main mods schedule to just have a look at the plan. That there will be other occurrences where there are reference to other documents that we haven't maybe picked up or discussed. I know that's an issue that Savills have raised in respect of AONB documents. We discuss on another day and another context, but it's just a common theme that runs through really. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to 295, and it's in relation to the travel plan requirements in Part B of the policy. And we asked the question as to whether, as expressed, it would be consistent with national policy. Again, look to the Council to explain your response, please.
Thank you. Across the plan as a whole, we have tried to be consistent with our requirement for major development to provide certain documents, and through the plan we are identifying major development according to that DM terminology as 10 dwellings or more, and this is really what we have employed through this policy in requiring travel plans to be submitted for applications of 10 dwellings or more. This is a key point that we feel we really do want to be requiring travel plans in order to look to adapt and mitigate against the impacts of climate change, which is a key objective of the plan as a whole, as you've heard this morning, and also key to establishing sustainable behaviours and that sort of modal shift in terms of looking at more sustainable patterns of movement through sustainable transport and active travel. We would obviously continue to keep that under review through the monitor and manage approach that we are promoting with regards to transport.
Generally speaking, through development management, would it be applied in a proportionate way? I'm assuming a scheme of 500 might require a far greater effort in terms of travel planning than a scheme for maybe 11 flats.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, any comments there? I mean, we have written comments on that, which we'll consider overall, but if no one wants to come in on that, we'll move on to criterion D. And again, if the councils wish to explain the rationale for criterion D.
Yes, just recognising first there was a slight error. The reference to the other policy should be SWDP 09, not 06, so that's referencing infrastructure policy. That policy sets out that developments will be required to provide additional or improvements to infrastructure, and that would obviously be in line with the Regulation 122 of the SIL regulations. Therefore, we consider the policy to be clear and unambiguous.
Okay, I mean, we've had various comments through representations and in statements on that. If anyone has anything they want to add to what they've already put, now's your opportunity. If not, we'll consider them. Consider what you've already put to us. Yeah? People are happy? Okay. Right, let's move to question 297. It's about part E of the policy requirement for electric vehicle charging. My note says as the main modification put forward in this regard, is that to delete the vote? Okay, and I think that meets the comments made about consistency with the building regulations, or not duplicating the various representatives. Yeah, okay. Right, let's move on to 298, which is concerned with part F of the policy that sets out a number of schemes. I think from the council statement, it sets out there actually schemes that are contained within the local transport plan at the moment. And they're schemes that are integral to the implementation of the plan as a whole. Anything to add to that?
Just to say that those schemes were reflected in the IDP and obviously then carried through into viability assessments. They have been assessed in that way as well.
Okay, and again, any comments around the room in respect to that? Nope, okay. Yep, Malvern.
Hello. I would like to raise with regards to the Jacobs report and the age of the data within that report. Some of it relates back to sort of 2011. And is that being considered or reassessed?
Okay, thank you. Councils?
So I think all the transport assessments have been updated with the Worcestershire Strategic Transport Modelling, which uses data from 2022. So that reflects updated information.
Okay, but is the mitigation considered in the plan? Is that the mitigation set out in the Jacobs report? I think is that the nub of your question? Actually, of the things that are set out in the Jacobs report reflected in the requirements in the plan, and have those been assessed?
Yes, that's correct. That was taken forward into the Do Something modelling, so that was reflected in the updated data as well.
Okay, so having had that answer, do you want to carry on where you want to go with the point?
Yes, I've got another point. With regards to third-party land assessed, there seems to be little sort of consideration of that third-party land within that assessment. I would say possibly upwards of 40% of those junctions assessed impact us directly. But we've not been consulted.
I think we've covered some of these points in previous sessions, but I think there clearly is maybe still a bit of a gap to close here. So, Mr. McLeod?
I think we've covered the point about Malvern Hill Trust land and obviously the process which was sort of clearly set out in the previous hearing that applicants would need to go through. We went through site by site in terms of, I think it was left in the end to about 2 sites which require approval from the trust. So that process is clear. In terms of other land ownerships, obviously, the bulk of the measures which we're putting forward through this plan are under the control of the county council or developers. If there was specific junctions which are outside of that ownership, then obviously both the county and ourselves would be able to recourse to CPO powers if we're needed to acquire land to bring those improvements forward.
Okay, thanks for that. So, is there a further point you wish to make from the Malvern Hills Trust about that? Or I'm just a bit concerned there might be a bit of a gap between what we're hearing and maybe some unanswered question that perhaps you have, maybe we should have. Or has that really covered it off? Because now's the opportunity to do it.
Is it possible to raise the issue of the Newlands roundabout?
As an example, I think if you've got some concerns you want to express to us, so now's your opportunity to do so, so please do.
The data I've got from the initial data on this was taken back in 2011. It's currently being remonitored at the moment, and that junction's got to be modified quite a bit. There are different sort of land ownerships around that junction. And I suppose it's a consideration of all the parties that are affected.
Okay, but without wanting to stray a bit off piece here, the council's got a response to that.
We believe that scheme's called planning permission. So again, we don't see there being any impediment to those junction improvements coming forward.
Okay, it may be a matter that, given you're in the same room, maybe to have a bit of a chat offline and see if there's and to try to resolve it, whatever the question is that way. It may not be something for us, but if it is, maybe have a chat with the council and maybe the council can come back to us on that. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, moving on to question 299, criterion H. I think the council are suggesting a main modification to, my note says, move the reference to the reason justification. Yeah. Okay, moving on to question 300, which is about protecting sites and corridors listed in Part I of the policy. National policy says it should be robust evidence for safeguarding transport routes. Could the councils explain what the robust evidence is, please?
Yes, so these schemes and corridors are identified in the local transport plan. and therefore obviously supported by the County Council. They would support the delivery of the spatial strategy as a whole, which has a focus on sustainable public transport, and as I've already mentioned, that goes to meeting one of the key objectives of the plan in terms of mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. The schemes and corridors are shown on the policies map, and they are under a layer titled Safeguarded Land for Transport Infrastructure, and all of those schemes are reflected on the policies map.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if this matter that anyone else but us has picked up on. So no boards up. So I think we'll move on to question 301, which concerns criterion M. And our question was really how this relates to any works taken under the Highways Act. Again, if Council could explain the response, either the councils or the County Council.
So the works covered by section 278 specifically relate to sites for which the planning permission has been applied for, and the works are considered necessary to mitigate any impacts. This would not cover cumulative impacts of development on the public highway that would result in wider infrastructure requirements being or improvements being needed and being more expensive due to their scale and nature quite often of the work required. In these cases, it would be necessary to secure contributions from multiple developments potentially, obviously can't talk to a case-by-case basis, to fund such works. The appropriate mechanism for this would be through Section 106 agreements or the Community Infrastructure Levy, where those contributions can then be pooled to enable that work to take place.
Okay, thank you. My question is, I just wonder whether reference should be made to those cases where that wouldn't be necessary to go through to Section 106 or the SIL route, but it would be maybe a Highways Act case. Or am I just trying to make the plan more sound? You're not supposed to answer that, but
we can consider that, sir, if that's
okay.
helpful.
And then we'll look at it in a round, and I can
Yeah.
possibly delete my own suggestion. Okay, thank you. Okay, that brings us to the end of our questions on policy 6. Other than what we will do with revisiting Mitten, we won't be looking at coming back to transport again. So this is the final call for anyone that wishes to make a comment on policy 6. Or is everyone happy that they've said what they need to say? And if not, we'll move on. Everyone looks happy? You do? Okay. We will move on, but before we do, we will have a short break because I believe the councils wish to rearrange your team. So, shall we resume at 11:45? Is that? Yeah, plenty of time. Yeah. Thank you.
agenda for matter 16 and moving on to policy 7, which is about green infrastructure. So question 302 is, what is the justification for the requirements of the green infrastructure in criterion A? Criterion A sets out the requirements for housing developments with the thresholds. The Council's statement indicates that the previous policy was successful. The 40% and 20% requirements have been tested as part of the overall viability assessment for the plan. So the question that I've got really, and raised by other participants as well, is how that mandatory requirement for the 10% BNG is reflected within there. And I think there'll be other people looking to raise that. So if we could head that off at the beginning, that would be helpful. So how is the mandatory 10% BNG reflected or taken into account in the requirements in A?
So the intention isn't to sort of layer on the requirements, as it were. So the BNG requirements would obviously be reflected within either the 40% or the 20%. I think that should be clear enough in the policy, but if we feel there's a need for additional wording to make that abundantly clear, then obviously we would be happy with that. But the intention isn't to layer on the requirements at all.
Yeah, so that the next question was that was what is that clear and explained somewhere? I mean, I can ask the HBF to come in at this point if it was yours and another other people did mention this. If you'd like to make your point.
Yeah, I think, as I was hinted at earlier, I think we're finding BNG delivery to be more difficult than people expected in terms of money and in terms of time and in terms of land take. And therefore, because it's mandatory and because you can't do less than 10%, there needs to be flexibility in other parts of the plan to enable that to happen. And this is one policy where there may need to be more flexibility. And we're concerned about the viability appraisal because there isn't any data that could have possibly fed into the viability appraisal about BNG because there isn't any data now really about how much it costs, rather than more than it said in the DEFRA study, which was about 19 grand. And I think there's a confusion again between the cost per unit of BNG credits, which may or may not be necessary to buy 1 unit to deliver 10 houses or 10 units to deliver 1 house. So the cost of credits is not indicative of the cost of delivering BNG, and each site's different. So there's a massive variety in terms of, as I said, time and land take and complexity and willingness of councils across country to negotiate. So anything that can be put in place to say, if you have a problem with BNG delivering and it's mandatory and we can't fix it, come and have a chat with us about other things in the plan would be very helpful and reassure members that there's a way forward and the council's up for those discussions. It needs to be feeding in as early as possible in the plan process, and ideally you'd want it to be considered at allocation stage. But as this plan is quite advanced before this came in, that's probably unreasonable to ask them to do that now, and the local nature recovery strategies aren't in. But the idea in the future is you'll have that clarity about going forward. So in the absence of that clarity and being reasonable and proportionate, flexibility seems to be the sensible way forward for the plan to be sound.
Thank you, Mum. So I think to deal with your point, I don't think it is explicitly clear in the policy at the moment that the 10% is part of that. So I think if you look at criterions A1 and 2, if we included some wording at the end of that saying that those are the 40% GI excluding private gardens but inclusive of BNG requirements on points 1 and 2, that would avoid any risk of the policy being interpreted in the way that the BNG was on top of that. So I think that would address your concerns.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. Did you want to come back?
Yeah, I was just going to say you can have BNG in private gardens. That's the challenge.
So to be clear then, are you saying that A, Roman numeral 1, would need to look different from that point of view?
Yeah, because you can on-site delivery of BNG in gardens is possible, but you don't manage it and maintain it in the same way. You don't secure it by conservation covenant. It's a whole different element, and that's one of the complexities of delivering BNG that we're finding, and policies that are quite rigid. It proves challenging. So in this case, if they excluded gardens, then gardens could count for BNG and they're not for the GI, so that would be contradictory.
Have you got any views on that, on the garden point?
Well, we don't see the green infrastructure requirement should quite rightly really be excluding private gardens. So, that's looking obviously the site-wide, the site as a whole, and how green infrastructure comes forward as part of that. I probably need to have a think about where's the best place to put it in.
I would have thought it's quite clear, isn't it? The 40% GI excludes private gardens but includes BNG. That's all we need to say, and then
it's a point for somewhere else rather than within the GI policy. Is my feeling.
Yes.
As in, the garden point is right in here because GI perhaps isn't gardens,
Yes.
but BNG mandatory requirement could be. So that perhaps is a point for somewhere else other than not in policy 07 is what I'm saying.
Okay. But shall we take the point away and then just... I think we all need... We all understand where we're trying to get to. It's just making sure we do. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so if we move on to question 303, which is about criterion B, whether it's clearly written and unambiguous so that it's evident how a decision maker should react to development proposals. So criterion B concerns employment and retail proposals and for GI requirements to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And I gather it's in here because it was absent from the previous version of the policy, and you're seeking to sort of address that as a previous omission. The only question I've got really is whether, as written, B in itself requires any sort of a requirement at all. So should it repeat some, as it stands alone from A, should it repeat some of A and say employment and retail proposals are required to contribute towards the provision of, and then move on to how those will be determined? Because does that make sense?
Yes, that would make sense.
Okay, so if we move on to question 304, is about concerns criterion C and whether Roman numeral 3A, oh no, just 3, is clearly written and unambiguous. This is about the GI concept plans and concept statements, which part of this wider point that they're not part of the development plan for their area, so how should we be referring to them? Now, I think there's an MM.
That's correct, Mom. So we're proposing the deletion of that requirement. It's obviously that's duplicative in relation to these strategic allocations themselves.
Yeah, I think there's another MM to the final sub-criterion of C, is there as well? Because it duplicates earlier parts of the policy, I think.
That's correct, Mom. That's proposed for deletion as well.
Okay, so question 305 is about criterion D. That relates to the management requirements, but also the designation of land as green space for the purposes of policy 44. So we've seen the council's response in the statement. I suppose the question is whether all GI secured through planning permissions will be suitable for designation as green space, and does that maybe need clarifying in the policy? I don't know. It's a question to think about really more than.
And that's probably is one we need to take away, Mum, just to have a look at that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, did I miss you from before? Or?
No, it's absolutely fine. It's in regard to this question, 305, and it's actually agree with your point that that second sentence isn't quite clear as to once the planning permission has been implemented, the associated GI will be protected as green space. So sort of green verges along public highways, will they be protected as public green space? So yeah, I agree with that.
Some wording like where appropriate might be the way of dealing with it.
I think that's possibly all it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so criterion E, that concerns the environmental character areas map, which isn't part of the development plan. So I think there's a change on this whereby you're proposing to put the character areas on the proposals map, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, and then obviously there'd need to be a reference in the policy somewhere that says as shown on the maps. It's just tying up all of the loose ends. So question 307 is about criterion F. This is about the building with nature or equivalent benchmarks. So we've made a mistake there. The question relates to criterion G, not F. And G requires major developments to comply with those standards. I think there's an MM to delete, is that right? Okay, so I'll move on to question 308, which is about the areas of informal recreation, or the AIRs, and the justification for these. Question 309, I'm going to take 309 and 308 together because they're basically about the same thing. There's a considerable number of changes now proposed on this one. I think it's right that the latest ones are in the Statement of Common Ground with Natural England. I think it's exam 90, that very recently dated, 22nd of April. And those supersede anything that we'll see in the schedules. Okay. So, as I understand it, there's only one AIR sought for allocation, and then a new policy that would embed that and have a DM focus as well, and then some other changes to policy 7 as a result. So can you just outline what the latest position with that, and how you've got there?
Yes, thank you, Mum. So obviously the principle of AIRs has come forward from the footprint ecology report in terms of how we can look to mitigate impacts on the SSSI. There's been extensive engagement with Natural England in relation to this policy. The AIR at Honeybourne is still seen as being deliverable, so we've continued to include that within the plan. The other AIRs are proposed for deletion, and that mainly reflected site-specific discussions about their ability to come forward as an AIR. To replace that, we've put forward a development management policy which will encourage the provision of AIRs, which still obviously meets the objectives of the footprint ecology report, and where Natural England obviously see this as a key approach in terms of mitigating the impact on the SSSI itself. So that the details of that DM policy, I won't read it all out, but it's obviously supports provision, additional provision, particularly within the zone of influence and closer to the SSSI itself. We've had then the background paper on AIRs talks about some of the other options which we're looking at, and we have ongoing discussions with landowners in Malvern about how AIRs could still come forward, and Malvern Council itself has identified potential SIL funding to help facilitate how AIRs could be delivered in practice. So we feel with Natural England there's a further change to the policy which would just reflected the the most recent discussions with Natural England around in perpetuity funding and how we would look at that through the review of the plan. We're agreed with Natural England that the evidence base isn't there at the moment to justify in perpetuity funding. There is obviously funding contributions identified to the SSSI and how those would be collected, but they don't look at in perpetuity funding. What the change which we put forward with Natural England is basically reflecting their desire, along with us, to look at a longer term strategy for funding through the hills, but the evidence base would need to be developed as part of a local plan review to be able to demonstrate that. So that additional criteria has been discussed at length with them, and that's another additional proposed modification that we're putting forward to you. But on the basis of the statement of common ground there, we have reached agreement, obviously, with Natural England that the impacts on the SSSI can be mitigated based on the package of measures which you have in front of you today.
Okay, just because you mentioned it there, so is that new criterion D that seeks the developer contributions that were in the actual new policy? So sorry, I said new, it's all new, but so that talks about, so in the brand new policy for heirs, it's in Appendix 2 of the Statement of Common Ground. Criterion D is now, I think, seeking financial contributions for major residential developments, which I think is new. I don't think...
Sorry, yeah, so just, I'll just go. So criterion D has been there so for some time. The criterion which I'm referring to is the new I. So what we've talked about with Natural England, and this is the additional piece which has come forward, is in relation to the review of the plan and in perpetuity funding. So there wasn't justification at this stage for in perpetuity funding in terms of this policy. So what we've talked about with Natural England is longer term we need to continue to develop the evidence base, particularly as housing and population pressures continue to grow. And in perpetuity funding, I think Natural England would say is an important consideration for longer term protections of the hills, and we would continue to work with them on the evidence base in relation to that matter. Criterion G, criterion, where was the previous one?
Yeah, they're in the different policies, so apologies there. So that you're talking me through I in the amendments to policy 7, and then the
Correct.
D that I was talking about is in the brand new policy. That's
Yes, yeah.
in terms of D, because it just another is that's definitely not, that's not a new requirement. Where was that previously in? Was it in 7 somewhere?
So, Mum, we've included the heirs funding is in the IDP, but we think you're correct that the criterion requiring that funding wasn't there in the earlier policy, so that has come forward in terms of the new drafting of heirs, so apologies for that.
That's okay. So I suppose the questions we have at that point then is whether seeking those contributions is justified and to be included at this stage. There's all the questions. I mean, I think you've explained what is major residential development, but we went through that earlier. Yeah, and then we move on to how would those contributions be calculated? Where would they be spent? Given that only one site has been identified, and you know, where would you find the guidance that went with that? An SPD, or I don't know.
In terms of how it would be spent, we would obviously get the developer contributions. SPD would be a mechanism for us to achieve that. We do feel the provision of airs is important. It's identified within the footprint ecology report as very important mitigation for the SSSI. So seeking funding towards that SSSI mitigation and the provision of airs themselves, it's certainly, and I think from a Natural England point of view, in terms of the mitigation on the hills, is an important aspect of that. So we've included that cost, the viability implications of that within the IDP, so that has been assessed from a viability perspective. But Natural England and ourselves are aligned that we do need that funding to come forward to help deliver that comprehensive package of mitigation which has been put forward for the Malvern Hills.
The airs are in the IDP. I don't think they're costed, are they? The costs are down as unknown, is that right?
There is a cost. It's So we've included 5.7 million, and that is based from the footprint ecology report, and that is for the establishment and the maintenance of airs going forward.
Which
So that's exam 17. What's the table reference? D.
15.
15. Sorry, Mum, table 15.
I suppose the final sort of where that leads you to then is whether there's any crossover between requiring the financial contributions for the heirs and then the new approach to contributions for the mitigation strategy. And are the heirs in the mitigation strategy, or is there a danger that you might be requesting contributions for twice, if you're with me?
Yeah, so there's separate mitigation and separate strategies, so I don't believe there's any potential there for double counting between the two.
Are the heirs in the? I don't think are the heirs in the mitigation strategy. We'll move on to this, but we weren't sure that they were as an entity.
They're definitely in there as part of the mitigation strategy for the SSSI itself. And and obviously, plan-wide mitigation strategy as well.
Sorry, ma'am, I might help just clarify that. So the heirs are a plan-wide green infrastructure strategy to increase public access to green spaces, and as part of a complementary approach to the on-site mitigation for the Malvern Hills SSSI. So they're not directly within the strategy.
It would just be in those locations that the potential for the double would arise. Sorry, it's a narrow. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I'm conscious that I've dominated that. Is there anybody on question 309 so far? Thank you. Yeah, Inchbolds.
Nicola Inchbald of Inchbald Planning. With the Inspector's Agreement, I have a plan which I'd like to present to you. I have mentioned this already to the local authority, so if I can give it to the programme officer. It's relating to a site, you're not considering emission sites, but it's in the context of the soundness of the local plan, how a leisure site might be able to come forward or not in the absence of specific policies and in specific relation to the SWDP 07 as the modification proposes. So with your agreement, I'd like to put forward the plan.
It's not normal for us to sort of...
No, it's in the context of the soundness of the plan overall, though, rather than an emission site.
I think I've seen your statement in relation to this matter, which I think is probably the site that you're going to be showing us the plan of, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's in our hearing statement.
Yes, yeah, that's what I mean in your hearing statement, but there isn't a plan, so it's the plan that associates with what you're telling us in the hearing statement.
Yes.
And the council have seen this?
Yes.
It's just difficult, you know, without knowing why it wasn't provided.
I think what we're saying is that this is a major proposal, which is well known and in the public domain. But at the moment, in the absence of policies which would allow for this to come forward, that we would be considered to be a departure, as we raised in our hearing statement. Obviously, MPPF advises that applications should be considered in the rounds of up-to-date development plan policies. And part of our argument is that there aren't. And SWDP 07, as proposed to be amended, may be able to be amended to allow for such things to come forward. But I think it's a useful example for the inspectors to consider, you know, on the ground how the policies might apply or not.
We're going to have to think about that and
Okay.
get back to you before the end of today. But
That's
for the
fine.
moment, if you could just keep it,
keep
it with you.
We'll keep it. No, appreciate that. But I think on the wider point, particularly in relation to the proposed modifications, we see that there's an inherent conflict between the need for mitigation. We've already identified this issue, particularly in respect to financial contributions. There's a conflict between the need to mitigate for the SSSI, Malvern Hills SSSI, and by implication the impact on the national landscapes, and the provision for green space requirements to provide for informal recreation for the existing and future residents of the housing schemes that are coming forward. So, and I think that that's, I may refer to the wrong criteria with this new policy, but I think that that's really identified in criteria 7 of the proposed modification. And the internal conflict between character, appearance and ecology of the landscape, and the need for people to get on and walk and their dogs and cycle and run and swim and all of those other things. And I think that there is a difficulty there. And I think the other thing, which again I think you've already picked up on, is the financial contributions. And we note that there was a paper that went to Malvern Hills recently on this. How can a privately owned scheme come forward under this if it is directly linked to developers making contributions towards its provision? The HBF might have something to say about such things. And I think that also we're concerned, and again, it's a mission policy rather than a mission site, but the lack of criteria for more formal sports and recreation. And we wonder whether the criteria of the proposed modification may allow for formal and informal sites to come forward and sit side by side. So that is one of the things that we would like to raise. And again, the reason justification talking about biodiverse and landscape-led spaces and high nature conservation value, we think does also have an internal conflict with the need for widespread public access. Indeed, part of the reason this policy is coming forward is the impact that people are having on important landscapes. So we think that there is a need to perhaps look at breaking out this policy, splitting it into 2 different policies, one for the mitigation on the Malvern Hills SSSI and one relating to the human need for green spaces and access to green spaces. I think part of the policy or the proposed modification might be addressed by actually a definition of what an air is, as opposed to a country park. Inspectors are aware that this policy was originally a country parks policy, which is now morphed into an airs policy. It's not clear what the differences are, what is a country park as opposed to what is an air, and how that might become a wider leisure and recreation policy to meet the requirements of paragraph 103 of NPPF. And I think just, finally, whilst we appreciate that this inquiry has been largely about homes and jobs and all of those really important things, the provision of policies to provide for a healthy population, particularly in respect of sports and leisure, are very important. And it just feels, and I suppose it is through the lens of the proposal that we will be bringing forward, is that there is an absence of policies in the proposed SDPR in respect of this. And what we are faced with doing in bringing forward a planning application, which will be judged on its merits at the time, is that we're trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear by kind of, forcing our proposal to meet a particular amended policy in the absence of the policies that would be required. So that's our views.
Thank you. Would the council like to respond on those points?
Thank you, Mum. I think the plan is at the back of the statement. I don't know if it's a different plan, but that's the plan that we've seen. So if it helps that is included there. So, I mean, it's important to set out, first of all, the purpose of the airs. So to relieve pressure on vulnerable areas of green infrastructure, such as the Malvern Hills Triple SI, but also others as well. So they're important plan-wide mitigations. So it's important not to confuse them in some ways with sports uses. So obviously here we have, as clear from the statement, a proposal for a rowing facility. That may well have merits in its own right, but we just need to go back to what is the function of an air. And the purpose of the airs obviously is to relieve that pressure, and the criterion approach which we've set out talks about walking, allowing people to informally walk their dogs or go play areas as well. So I think in relation to this specific proposal, the proposal may well have merits. There's a development management policy here which is proposed as to how this type of proposal could be assessed in terms of an air, but it would need to be wider than obviously just sports-related use, because that isn't the purpose of what an air is trying to achieve. There's that wider mitigation on recreational pressure, so it's there for a very specific reason. That recreational impact, can be considerable on the Triple SI, which are why these proposals are coming forward. This proposal, in our mind, is more suited to the development management stage. There's specific issues to be dealt with in terms of flooding, and obviously this is within flood zone 3. We haven't got enough supporting evidence around it currently in terms of how this proposal could come forward. But it's obviously a proposal which could have merit, and we'd be happy to explore it with the Rowing Club and Inchbold Planning to see how we could progress it, but it would need to be outside of the plan because we haven't got sufficient evidence to justify it as an allocation at this stage.
And are there any alternative policies within the plan, stepping aside from the one that we're looking at now, that would provide support for such a proposal?
Well, there's a range of policies there in terms of wider sports provision, playing fields, obviously. This is quite a specific proposal, which is why I think in some ways it lends itself to the DM process. It's obviously more for a rowing club type use. I think the points which are being made are more wider sort of sports provision. It could be addressed in that way, but it would almost need a new policy to that effect. The general policies that we have in the plan are more around green infrastructure provision, open space, as you would expect. I think there isn't a generic policy seeking sports provision per se, So I think that this is where this proposal would sort of fit, but that would need a new policy to come into that effect. So I think it's trying to fit something into an heirs policy, which is the proposal at the moment that's been developed, doesn't quite get there. It may well be able to get there with further development, but we just haven't got that level of detail at this point in time.
Thank you, that's helpful. Would you like to come back?
Yes, thank you. I think the summary actually identifies the problem precisely. It's not a proposal for a rowing club. The plan that we would like to table and has been forwarded to the policy officers shows the level of public footpaths, the 7-way national footpath around the site, and the general sports, informal sports provision that would be there. So I think there's a general misunderstanding in that respect. And yes, there are sports policies elsewhere in the plan, and again, this goes to the heart of what we're saying, is that they've been based on sports pitch provision. And if you look at the topic papers on informal recreation and the sports provision, it talks about pitches. It doesn't talk about any other kind of sports. It doesn't talk about water sports. It doesn't talk about anything. So we have nothing which we can actually say in the development management process the scheme is policy compliant, and that's what we're seeking to address today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's one for us to consider. I think we've heard both sides of that, and we'll take that away. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to reiterate a few general points. The impact of recreation on the Malvern Hills has been flagged for around 10 years now. This can be seen in Historic England's scheduled monument plans and Natural England's SSSI condition assessments, and most recently the Council's own report by Footprint Ecology. The problem the Malvern Hills has is that it's incredibly popular but also incredibly small. The SSSI is a 200th of the size of the Yorkshire Dales National Park, but it has incredible visitor numbers. And unfortunately, these are concentrated on the ridge, which is where you find the SSSI features and the scheduled monuments, and they cannot be moved. Malvern Hills Trust has been managing the site for over 140 years. Site management can only do so much. We can repair some damage, we can pick litter, we can advocate behaviour to be responsible, but the planning process has a huge part to play in protecting the hills indirectly. Recent meetings and reports have recommended that a strategic solution be the way forward, and that is what Natural England have advocated, and that should include alternative sites, which we've heard a bit about, on-site measures to better protect the hills themselves, and a buffer zone of no or very limited development around the SSSI itself, to name just 3. And these have worked very successfully in other sites, such as Cannock Chase. At present, we don't see a strategic solution, despite this being the nominated way forwards for this site. And if there was a strategic solution, it would include lots of the detail, Marm, that you were asking the planning department for 10 minutes ago. And that is its job, to include all of those details in one solution. The more detailed points, we're slightly on the back foot because of the recent nature of the new Statement of Common Ground with Natural England and the bank holiday in the middle, but we have got a few points to make on that. The heirs policy that is recommended, we're very pleased to have that, but as I read it, it seems very passive. It seems like there is a capability to have heirs rather than we will proactively try and find them to deliver this mitigation because it is needed now for the Malvern Hills SSSI. So there's perhaps some wording change required there. In terms of developer contributions, it seems to be a new change that the contributions are paying for the heirs, and there isn't too much talk about what else they will be funding. If we go back to the Footprint Ecology report, it has a large number of measures that could be funded, including on-site measures. In fact, it has a very detailed shopping list, for want of a better word, but reference to this on on-site measures, as well as the buffer zone, does not appear in the current Statement of Common Ground. Again, this would be picked up if a strategic solution were to be put in place. I think those are all the points I'd like to raise. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so when you're ready, if you'd like to respond.
Thank you, Mum. So some of those points have been actively addressed through the plan. So we've talked in previous sessions about the 500-metre buffer zone around the SSSI, and as we've said, there's no allocations proposed within that buffer zone. We couldn't include the specific wording of that buffer within the policy because obviously that's covering parts of Malvern Hills itself, so you'd be including existing settlements. So, but there's no allocations proposed within that buffer, so we've been clear on that point. We've set out a clear strategy in terms of mitigation on the SSSI. We understand the pressures on the hills, and the footprint ecology report clearly sort of sets that out. But what we've proposed is a comprehensive package. To say that it's passive just isn't right. We've allocated a site at Honeybourne. We've set out a criteria-based approach as well as securing funding then to bring forward the additional heirs themselves. So we're being as proactive as we can at this point. There's the evidence in terms of what is needed beyond what we've put forward is just not there, and that's Natural England's position as well. We've discussed this in detail with them, and the Statement of Common Ground with them reflects where we've got to at this point in time, that there's a clear evidence base put forward for this plan, which will allow mitigation and funding to come forward. We also then need to work with partners, including Malvern Hills the Trust and Natural England, around more active management of the hills. So those options need to be considered. There's obviously a lot of visitor pressure on the hills, and we need an approach going forward about how they are going to be managed with population and housing growth in the future. But that's further evidence work and needs to be done with Natural England and also neighbouring councils as well, and that's what we've committed to Natural England to continue to do.
Thank you. Yeah, just to sort of in defence of the councils and to reiterate what the Trust have said, that as the councils have said, that there's still quite a lot to work out in reference to the questions that you raised, and that this notion of strategic solutions is still relatively in early days, and there's quite a lot of work that still needs to be done, both in terms of the evidence base, for instance, whether a 500-metre exclusion zone is sufficient. More work is needed to be done in respect of that, for instance, as well as the amount and how the developer contributions are going to work. So, yeah, we're as the National Landscape team, yes, we're really pleased to see the incorporation of the heirs and also a mitigation strategy for the SSSI included in the plan. I think we're just wary that the policy doesn't limit all the work that has still yet to be done. So, for instance, like the Trust said, in terms of developer contributions, the footprint ecology mitigation strategy in the Appendix 2 has a whole, as Jonathan put it, shopping list of mitigation options or actions, and the heirs just being one part of that. So it's kind of ensuring that doesn't get lost within the policy wording. Yeah, so like Jonathan said, unfortunately, because of with the bank holidays and what have you, we've only sort of recently seen the Natural England Statement of Common Ground, which overall we're pleased with, but yeah, kind of whether it can be sort of revised or sort of not left open, of course, but just some acknowledgement that there's still quite a lot of work to be done sort of during the plan period to develop these strategic solutions. Thanks.
Sorry, so back to my points then, and looking at the new policy 07, no, revised policy 07, so the MMs in the Statement of Common Ground. It's just so that I'm clear before I move off it. So new H there is again, that's the second set of the developer contributions within the 25 kilometre zone of influence. And yeah, so that wasn't in the previous version either, was it? So that's another, so there's two separate clauses requiring developer contributions that have been introduced, yeah. So the reason that those weren't in before is because of the nature of discussions with Natural England, is it? And the late sort of emergence of those agreements. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
That's correct, Mum. So they've reflected the really evolving discussions with Natural England. We did put the contributions in at the Reg 19 stage from a viability assessment point of view, because we felt that there would be some financial mitigation needed to protect the triple SI and to deliver the mitigation strategy. But the details of that strategy have evolved really with the discussions with Natural England as we've moved forward.
Right, thank you. Final one then is criterion G, and just on policy 7, just is that necessary or required over and above the now that you've got the new policy suggested in relation to heirs? Do they double up, and are they consistent?
I mean, it's more of a pointer to the heirs policy, which obviously comes.
It might want to be in the supporting text rather than in G.
I think that would make sense, absolutely.
Right, be pleased to know that's everything I've got on that one. Did you want to add?
Yeah, very briefly, winding back a bit to environmental character areas map. In the council statement, it refers to 3 documents that I think would provide the justification for the environmental character areas. But I may be wrong, but I don't think they're in the evidence base. I may have missed it.
The documents you're referring to are available through the County Council, and we're happy to submit those if that would help, or cross-reference them specifically.
Yeah, I think it would. If we can be provided with a link to them in the meanwhile, just any main modification that's published referring to that, without the justification, people could quite rightly say, well, hang on a minute, where's the justification for this? So it's just really cutting off that circular argument. So I think they would probably need to go into the library.
We'll do that, so we'll put those to Mr. Kemp.
Yep, lovely, thank you.
Okay, anybody else with anything on policy 7 before we move on? Nope. Okay, so we'll move on to policy 44, which is green space. So question 331 is, what is the justification for the designation of specific areas of land identified on the policies map as green space? Does the policies map adequately identify the green spaces? So I think initially, if we can just deal with the justification for the policy, whether it's effective, having regard to the policies map, and then we'll move on to the site-specific issues that I know a few people have. So you might have to just bear with us while we get through the first bit, and then we'll move on to the sites. So I've seen from the council statement that the approach is informed by the open space assessment from 2019, which had some minor updates in 2021. So can you just outline really in terms of the study, the original study, how the sites were assessed? Was each site individually assessed? And are there any, can we find the individual site assessments? We haven't been able to, but it's not a make or break, it's just are we missing them?
The green spaces that are identified under this policy come from a number of different sources. The starting point really is the green spaces layer from the existing policies map of the adopted plan. That has been looked at and updated to ensure any spaces that have been developed or anything that needs to be taken out can be taken out. The second source is really green spaces secured through S106 legal agreements arising from associated planning permissions that have been granted since the adoption of the local plan. And then finally, it's the open spaces assessment, as you've already mentioned, which is exam document reference TLC 1 to 6, and the individual typologies. The evidence base, unfortunately, doesn't provide individual site assessment sort of documents that we can refer back to. It looks at it kind of on a wider basis, and yeah.
Because were they done and they're not available, or was it a different kind of exercise to the one that I'm got in my head, I suppose?
It was a very high-level assessment undertaken as a mapping exercise rather than on a sort of producing a document, site-specific document for each site. It was almost like a constraints-type mapping exercise that you might undertake for other types of assessment.
So just in terms of the age of that, with it being 2019, I know there was the minor adjustments in 2021, which were quite specific. Is that considered to be, do you think anything will have changed in practice on the ground, or are you happy to rely on 2019 data?
Generally, we're happy to rely on the data. Where there have been changes that we're aware of, as I've already mentioned, through officer judgment, we're proposing to make updates to that layer on the policies map to really ensure that it is giving the most up-to-date position.
So just on the maps then, see we've gone there. So the open space assessment sets out the typologies of different types of green space, and there's quite a few, isn't there, on that table there, table 3. But in terms of the maps, then the layer is only one for a singular layer for green space and urban biodiversity corridors. Is there other layers underneath that cover the typologies, or is everything just covered in?
So in terms of the layers that would be represented on the policies map, I think you'll see through our written statement we're proposing to separate out the green space and urban biodiversity corridors into separate layers. They're currently combined at the Reg 19 stage. And then linked to those, like you mentioned, there's the open space assessment, which sets out the typologies. Now they do form part of the green space layer, but they also are itemised separately on the policies map, so they can be switched on and off and shown as well if you want to see the specific typologies from that evidence base, but they also form part of the overall green space layer, which does have other designations in it that officers have picked up through the mapping exercise for further green space.
So there is a layer there that if it just said allotments, you'd be able to screen through and just pull up all the allotments.
Yes, the open space assessment, we've got all the GIS data for those separate typologies that we can show on the policies map.
Are they shown at the moment on the interactive map that we've been looking at? Are they there? Because this might be an us thing, but as we've looked at it, you click in green space and then there's no indication from there as to what sort of green space we're dealing with. So it could be a pitch, it could be an allotment. Obviously you've got the title, but then even with the information tool, we can't tell what it is. And apologies if this is just us with maps.
Can I just have a look to check what status is? Thank you. I think that the map does reflect those sites, but it would need to be updated so that they're split out and clearly itemised so that they can be interactive on the policies map.
Okay, because the question that we would come back to really is whether having all those multiple designations under one layer, whether that's an effective policy. So if they could be separated out and we can see each one as a separate thing, and then we know which policy applies to which piece of space that we might be looking at. So put better, that's the typology boundaries shown separately. So in terms of the urban biodiversity corridors, I think you just mentioned there that there's a proposal you've already put a proposal for a main modification to split those off. Is that right? I'm not sure I've seen that.
Yes, it's covered in one of our written statement responses.
I think the other question on the urban biodiversity corridors raised by other people that aren't here today is whether that is that a green space? Is it a policy 44 allocation, or is it more a GI designation that you would look to protect under policy 7?
It's linked to policy 27, the biodiversity policy, but it does have multifunctional green infrastructure components. So some of the urban biodiversity corridor designations would also be green space, but they have been separated out because there are some distinctions between the two in terms of there are urban biodiversity corridors which are not green space, for example. So just making that distinction clear, and that would be reflected on an update to the policies map.
So those ones would have like a double layer, if you like. So you'd be protecting them as green space under policy 44. Is that?
Yes, that's correct.
So just in terms of the requirement that the land that comes forward through planning permissions is included then as green space on the policies map. That's another one that's been raised by people that aren't here today. It's just how that works really if you're constantly updating a policies map rather than just updating your interactive layer that we all look at, because to update the map obviously requires a review of the plan, and how do those two work together?
Since our submission of our written statement, we are proposing that the update to the policies map would take place through plan review. We would effectively freeze the policies map at at a point in time. We're proposing the 1st of April this year, so any updates to that point would be included, and thereafter it would be captured through plan review. We would obviously keep a back office record and then update it through plan review.
Thank you, that's helpful. Okay. Yep, nobody. So if we move to question 332. So is 44B, which might be something else now. No, it's still B. Consistent with paragraphs 98 and 99 of the framework. Those are the ones that relate to open space and recreation. So 44B sets out the development of green space will not be supported unless a number of exceptional circumstances are demonstrated. So it's really the question is whether the use of that phraseology of exceptional circumstances in B, does that accord with the framework, and does it have some green belt connotations that you might want to avoid?
Yes, again, since we submitted our written statement, we would be proposing to remove the word exceptional from that from that criterion.
I suppose the other question on B. No, bear with me, I think. Yeah, sorry, I'm back with it. On B is whether all those requirements or the circumstances that need to be demonstrated are all taken from the framework, aren't they? It's whether those are even necessary, and whether B could just say it would just need to meet the requirements in the framework in terms of that are set out at para 99.
Apologies. Yes, no, we would be happy to amend the policy as you suggested and just refer back to the MPPF.
It just avoids any, where we slightly deviate from the actual wording, and yeah, thank you. Yeah, Tetlow King.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't know if you're going to come back to sort of site-specific concerns about justification. I'll leave that and part of that aside. The only issue with Part B and with amending it as per the open space paragraphs in the MPPF is that the designations don't only cover areas of open space. They also cover, businesses and other institutions. So other parts of the MPPF, such as encouraging employment uses and economic development, as well as education uses. There's limited criteria. Without reference to the parts in the MPPF, which also encourage that, the policy wouldn't allow for those areas, those uses, I should say, which aren't typically open space, but are covered by this policy.
Yeah, we are going to move on to educational uses and sort of buildings, I suppose, that are washed over within the open space designations. When we get, I've just parked that for the site-specific bit, if that's all right. But in terms of referring to the framework, instead of doing B, the criteria under B, it's just the same thing, I think. I don't think it would pick up your point. I don't think it would make any worse or any better, if you're with me.
If it only referred to the open space paragraph about MPPF, about quantity and quality, if that makes sense. No, it wouldn't.
But that's basically what's written in the policy just now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Planning prospects.
I'm not sure if this sort of goes to a wider issue, but I think the policy sort of being a green space policy is a bit confusing because it's really an open space policy, and it merges a little bit into the local green space side of things in the MPPF, and I think what you've just suggested in terms of focusing Part B of the policy on paragraph 99 is helpful because it just avoids those potential sort of misunderstandings in terms of that local green space side of things, if you see what I mean. It just helps clarify, I think, because that was one of our big concerns, is that when you look at the council's justification for the policy, it does go into issues around sort of biodiversity and other issues that aren't necessarily relevant to open space, and it does sort of move towards that local green space side of things, which was a big concern for us, which we'll go into on the site-specific side of things. So I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. I mean, my understanding is there are no local green spaces proposed within this plan. They're left to the neighbourhood plan. So there shouldn't, I mean, I understand the confusion about terminology, but in terms of the actual allocations, they're not in here.
Yeah, I think that's fine, but that needs to be sort of clear, because the MPPF does allow local plans to designate local green space as well as neighbourhood plans. So it's just, to me, when I read it, it just sort of started moving towards that. So it's just something to bear in mind. So I think pulling it back to paragraph 99 specifically is helpful in terms of making sure it doesn't move towards that.
Okay, sorry, the council's view on that.
The reason the policy is titled Green Space is that it's been pulled through from the adopted plan, and that was the policy in the adopted plan. If it was felt that it would provide better clarity to call it an open space policy, we would be happy to consider that. But yeah.
So before we move on to the site specifics, then I think there's some other amendments that have been proposed, perhaps in the AMs, in relation to points made by Sport England. Can you just talk us through what those are? I think it's to do with the playing fields policy. It might be just be tidying up references to the right documents. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you. So the proposed modification to the green space, yes, has come from a statement of common ground with Sport England, where their concern was that for criterion B, BI, they considered that the policy could potentially result in development that wouldn't be sports related. So they proposed that one of the options that we went forward is to state that considering the potential for loss of playing fields, that part BI would not apply. So that's the proposed modification, but that's now mindful of potential changes in terms of aligning with 99. So we'll take that, consider that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all I've got on those. Thank you. So if we can move on to the site-specific issues that people have. I don't mind who goes first.
So, I mean, we've obviously made representations on behalf of the University of Worcester. I think the first question is, and notwithstanding that part of the St John's campus was identified as a green space in the previous SWDP, it's not entirely obvious why the university land has been identified as green space, to be protected as green space. I mean, in both cases, so we've submitted representations for St John's campus and Lakeside campus. We also submitted representations for land that the university owned at Evandine Close, but they don't own that land anymore, so we've sort of pulled the representations on that. We've obviously sent some plans which are hopefully helpful to show you the extent of the university campuses and the extent of the green space as we've sort of seen it on the policies map. And I mean, it looks like they've been allocated because they're playing pitches or sports pitches. So we sort of mentioned in our representations that in our view it's sort of unnecessary layering because those sports pitches are protected by, or will be protected by SWDP 46 anyway. If there's any other reason why the university land is identified for green space, it's not obvious. And again, looking at the council's response to the question, it says SWDPR 44 aims to protect open spaces identified on a policies map. This includes numerous small and incidental open spaces that contribute to the quality and character of their areas. These are often valued, and again, that's why we sort of started getting a bit concerned about the local green space point. It says, whilst most open spaces are publicly accessible, some are in private ownership, although nonetheless perform valuable functions such as contributing to biodiversity, the character of the area, and providing a sense of openness and place. So just reading that, I don't think that applies to the land in the university's campuses because, as I said, in both instances, they're playing pitches. So I guess that's why they've been identified. And then when you look at the St John's campus, the additional area just looks a bit arbitrary in terms of being green space. For example, we highlighted on the plan that the area to the north of the northern playing pitch is actually student accommodation. The areas around that is sort of incidental to that student accommodation, and that accommodation is now 30 years old, so at some point the university is going to need to either bring forward new accommodation or perhaps just replan that part of the campus. I didn't identify on the plan that actually there's an area to the southeast of the southern area of public open space, which is actually overflow parking. It's got planning permission for overflow parking. And again, that just sort of goes to the point that this is a university campus. It's not sort of publicly accessible. It's not a case of the university looking to in the future, develop open space. They're looking, if they need new facilities, they need to put it within their campus. So by identifying it as open space, they've then got to jump all these additional policy hurdles. And it's welcome that the exceptional circumstances point is going to be removed. But again, it just points to that unnecessary layering. Obviously, if the playing pitches that they are protected by SWDP 46 anyway, so I just don't think there's any need for land within a university campus to be identified as open space.
Okay, so would you, just to be clear, what you'd be seeking instead of what's shown on the map at the moment, would you be seeking just the pitches to be identified under the general, no, it wouldn't be general anymore, but as pitches, and then the peripheral areas shown in green on your maps to not be allocated as anything? Is that what's sought?
Yeah, I think so, because they don't perform any function as open space. And going back to the 2019 assessment, it does recognise that. I think it identifies the open space as an education typology, and it recognises that the SWCs don't have any control or ability to manage those, so it doesn't identify any standards for that typology. So it seems a bit strange that it then seeks to control and manage it through the application of the policy.
Yeah, would the council like to respond?
Thank you. We don't feel the policy is overly restrictive in that Part B1 has the circumstance, or the exceptional circumstances it's currently worded, that the proposal is for community recreational use. If you look back to the reason justification for supporting policy SWDPR 43, which is built community facilities, and paragraph, sorry, my computer's jumping around. Under paragraph 4.2 of the reason justification, part C, educational establishments such as schools and colleges are clearly shown there. So we don't feel it would be overly restrictive. On the policies map, buildings at that location are clearly not covered by the green spaces designation. They have been cut out of that layer. So we don't feel that it is an overly restrictive policy.
So in terms of the education typology, there is some explanation of that in the open space assessment. Is it also to do with public access, or is that not part of what was considered under those uses?
The land identified as green space can be public or private. It's about that green space, that open space, and the role and function it plays.
It's just that the open space assessment, that talks about some dual use agreement, obviously only in Malvern Hills, but I wasn't clear whether that was a prerequisite to the site meeting. No. Okay. Just to help us in terms of that, the site-specific that we just talked about. So everyone's understood why the pitches are. Alec, can you just explain how the surrounding areas that have been sort of explained do qualify, as it were, under open space? And the education typology, presumably.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it is. It's linked. These typologies have been brought through to the green and designated as green space through the open space assessment, and these are the sites that Ethos assessed as part of that. So the data we've got has been brought through from the consultants who undertook the work, but like you've alluded to, it is, in terms, yes, there's pictures have been brought up, but it is that, slightly wider context of what's around those pictures that provides that function and use as well. So that would have been the assessment of the consultant at the time who provided those polygons to us as for those specific areas, what the function and overall use and maybe the surrounding ancillary area contributes to that function as well.
I think I've got sort of 3 points just to come back on that. I think if you go back to the 2019 assessment, as you say, it refers to the dual use agreements, but then the final part of that just sort of says quantity, quality and access standards are not proposed for education sites. This is because they're not openly accessible to the public, and whilst important to the local community, there's less opportunity for the SWCs to influence their provision and management. So again, it just goes to that point of, but that's what this policy is trying to do. It's trying to influence their management of their campus. The second point, just in terms of going back to BI, except that that allows proposals for community and recreational use. And if you go back to SWDP 43, I think was mentioned, that then allows college and school and hopefully by sort of definition university as well, in terms of community and recreational uses. But BI then says, so it allows the community and recreational use, but then it says that does not compromise the essential quality and character of the green space, its green infrastructure functionality, or its part in the wider green infrastructure network. So again, it goes back to that point. It might allow alternative facilities, but you then need to demonstrate how it hasn't adversely impacted upon the green space itself. But if we don't really know why it's being allocated as a green space, other than because it's next to a playing pitch, as I say, a lot of that land that we've identified isn't associated with the playing pitch. It's associated with the wider campus and in particular the halls of residence. I think when you normally think about a playing pitch and when Sport England sort of look at playing pitches, they look to allocate the whole area around the playing pitch, because that area can also be used for sports and recreation. But in this case, the two pitches are sort of 3G pitches with large fences around them, so there isn't that association. So I think they're the 3 points really.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mum. So it's ultimately this is a site in the central Worcester. It's called green space there, whether it's public or private. It's entirely appropriate for us to be seeking to protect what is termed the green space within this area. So there's nothing unusual about that. It's used by, whether it's used by residents, whether it's used by students. It's still, we've specifically excluded the buildings, but retained the green infrastructure here, which is, the purpose of this policy is to protect green space. This is green space. If the university wanted to promote proposals for development, they'd need to assess it against this policy. But protecting that policy as a first principle is what we should be seeking to do, and that's why the proposal is as it is.
Just a quick question about how these various areas come to be designated. You've described it was done as what sounds like a desktop exercise. Has there been any, the awful phrase, ground proofing of this, or ground truthing? Or is it just a case of looking at, which I've got in front of me now, Google satellite images?
Desktop-based assessment mainly, but obviously the officers conducting that assessment would be very familiar with their areas, so they'd have combined that with a combination of site visits and desktop exercise.
Okay, and that has led, does it then, to some amendments being made to some of the layers? You described the layers affecting the university being amended.
That's correct, and we've obviously specifically tried to exclude the buildings and focus obviously on the green areas, open space within the university campus.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tatlow King.
Thank you. I may be going back over some of the similar arguments that were expressed about the university, but I think it's key to understand that the basis for designating education sites is the open space assessment, and the point's been made that today and in the open space assessment that the value of education sites as open space is often limited due to the lack of public access. The open space assessment, I think at page 94, says that none of the education sites were actually surveyed. So I'm not sure what further assessment has occurred since the open space assessment effectively provided a desktop audit of open spaces in Malvern in this case. Abbey College, who I'm representing today, they have a campus, and at the campus is a residential boarding school, but there also are 17 business tenants who operate there in the form of office space. So the actual typology of the site isn't reflected accurately in the open space assessment. The open space assessment includes the majority of the campus, including its buildings, and that has been copied through to the designation. So unlike the university, we have buildings washed over by this designation. Many of the buildings at Abbey College will need to be renovated, in future, and as it stands, the policy would restrict that. And on that basis, we don't think it's consistent with the MPPF, especially in respect of education, where the MPPF encourages choice in education uses, and similarly in respect of employment, where the MPPF expects planning policy to help create the conditions in which businesses can invest and adapt, and require significant weight to be given to the need to support economic growth. So in that respect, we don't feel that the designation is justified. The missing step is an assessment of public value and whether the public value of that open space triggers the need for a protection under this policy. And in the case of Abbey College, on account of the facilities it has, the lack of public access, only the students who are at the school use any of the spaces at the site. And visually, you can't really see into the site either. So if we take away the open space provision as a benefit, or as we give that less value due to the circumstances I've just discussed, I'm not sure what this policy is trying to protect. I know the council's statement suggests it's also trying to protect things like biodiversity, the character of the area, openness. All of these, things are important and are protected by other policies in the plan and in the MPPF, especially given Abbey College is in the conservation area and in the national landscape. So there's a host of other ways to protect those important things. So I'm just unclear really on what this policy is seeking to achieve, and I'm concerned that it will prejudice not just the future growth of the education and employment use at the site, but also just general, maintenance works which are necessary to keep up with, ongoing educational standards which are constantly seeking for improvement, rightly so. So that's really our concern about the designation. We've made recommendations in our statement, the first being to remove Abbey College completely from the designation, and that's our preference. But if you find that there are open spaces at the college which are of public value, which you consider need to be protected, then the designation should be very specific to those areas only. As put into the, as well as that, those spaces are protected, for example, by the playing pitch policies. So in respect of the designation, that's where we stand. In respect of the wording of the policy, the point I was trying to make earlier was just that there are employment uses and an education use at this college, at this campus. As it stands, the policy is quite prohibitive to that. To work to improve, adapt, or expand the college buildings. The policy should include some wording to reflect that if these types of uses are included within the designated areas. And our final recommendation of the statement does provide some additional wording which is reflective of the MPPF's expectations for those uses.
Thank you, Mum. Well, I don't think the MPPF says we can't be protecting school playing fields or green spaces. So no, we don't agree with the complete removal of this site. It's within the AOMB. Where I think I have a bit of sympathy here is the existing buildings are sort of washed over by the green space designation. So I think we'd be happy to look at excluding the buildings from the green space itself. But public access is not a prerequisite to protecting playing fields, green space. It's an element of it. This area in particular is very prominent. It's visible. It's had a previous planning application, I believe, refused on it as well. It's visible to the public from other areas of the hills, and protecting it as green space is entirely appropriate. But as I said, where there could be some flexibility here to make it consistent with the university is the existing buildings within the green space area could be excluded from the plan. And I think that would be an appropriate measure which would address some of the points which have been made.
Thank you. Do you want to respond on that? Only if you want to. There's no.
Yeah, I mean, I think our preference is for the whole campus to be removed. We understand that we understand and respect the fact that you can protect open spaces and should protect open spaces of public value, which is what the MPPF suggests, and the PPG. If the council would like to discuss with us the areas to exclude from the designation, we're more than happy to do that. But our initial preference, of course, is to remove the whole campus.
Yeah, we've got those points. Thank you. And if you want to talk to each other outside of this, that would be helpful. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Just a quick thought about other educational areas that have been identified. Would there be similar situations that have been drawn to our attention where buildings are included within spaces? I haven't gone into the layers and looked at it. I'm just posing that question, just one of consistency, where educational facilities are identified. It may include, say, secondary schools or whatever, with buildings covered, but by the same logic, perhaps shouldn't be.
And we'd have to check that, sir, but that could be the case.
Okay, well, if you maybe invite you to do that and perhaps come up with a list of changes to the appropriate typology, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I think some of the points that were made about this sort of being green space and needs to be protected as such, and I think the points made about the sort of community value needs to inform whether or not it is green space. I just keep going back to that part I of B. So any proposals for community recreational use or university, school, education, college use, you need to sort of demonstrate that you're not compromising the essential quality and character of the green space, its green infrastructure functionality, or its part in the wider green infrastructure network. If the open space assessment is based on a dated desktop review, how do you sort of demonstrate that you're not compromising the essential quality and character? Because what is the essential quality and character of that specific location? And as has been alluded to, if you do need to bring forward additional sort of educational built development, you have to go through that test in order to demonstrate that it is policy compliant.
Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, it's not a dated review, but there's a process to go through, and an applicant would have to go through that process before they could look to change the use of that land, and that's an entirely reasonable process to have set out within the policy.
We've got the points, I think, unless there's anything else you wanted to add. Yep.
Only to cover, I mean, very site specific, but at Abbey College, outside of where the buildings are, there is a swimming pool. And it was just more of a question to the council as to whether they would see this policy restricting works, you know, to put a cover over the pool, like a built pool house over the top of a swimming pool, given some of the characteristics and the reason justification include protecting characteristics such as openness. And obviously a building in open space would be detrimental to openness or could be seen in that way. So just more a real world question in relation to our site.
Okay, I'm going to push that to the offline discussion then on that very site specific, because I don't think it's going to the root of the soundness of this policy, if that's all right. Okay, thank you. The only other site specific that I have left over that I thought Savills might be here for, but I think you were both not the relevant Savills people for Malvern College. Are they not here today? Do you know? Sorry, I'm asking you simply.
Yeah, sorry, it's actually a colleague of mine. They're not here today to actually.
That's fine. Well, we have their written statement anyway, so I'm not wishing to labour those points. Okay, so it's definitely lunchtime. It's 1:25. So if we could have maybe a bit of a longer break, because we've had very short ones this morning, and resume at 2:15. Is that okay? Does that give everyone a chance? If you want a bit longer, it's fine. We can say 2:30 is fine. Yeah. So if we can resume at 2:30, and we'll carry on with the next policy on the revised agenda when we come back. Thanks.